I woke up to silence, the kind that feels wrong before you even open your eyes. My bare feet touched cold hardwood where my rug used to be. I walked into my bedroom doorway and froze. My bed was gone. My dresser, my bookshelf, the rocking chair my mother left me, all of it vanished. I ran downstairs. The living room looked like a crime scene minus the tape. Just dust, outlines where furniture once stood, and a single note on the kitchen counter. My father's handwriting. Nicole, we needed the money for Paris. Emily deserves this trip. She's been through so much. You understand, don't you? You will always do. My hands were shaking when I called him. I could hear her airport announcements in the background, Emily laughing about first-class champagne. Daddy had to sell your old stuff, she said like she was explaining something to a child. You weren't using it anyway. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I just smiled. Because in 15 days they'd come home, and I'd have a gift waiting that would bring my sister to her knees. Have you ever been the understanding one until understanding finally broke you? My name is Nicole Jennings. I'm 36 years old and I work as a senior financial consultant at one of the most respected firms in the city. I've spent 15 years building a career that most people would envy, managing portfolios worth millions, advising executives on decisions that shape companies. But if you asked my family about me, they'd probably struggle to remember what I do for a living. 2 days before everything changed, I was sitting in my corner office reviewing quarterly projections when my phone buzzed. The name on the screen made me pause Dad. He rarely called. In 17 years, I could count on one hand the number of times he'd reached out first. I answered on the third ring, keeping my voice neutral. Hi, Dad. Nicole. He cleared his throat the way he always did when he was uncomfortable. I need you to come home. There's something important we need to discuss. Is everything okay? Is Emily all right? Of course, that was my first question. It was always about Emily. She's fine. Everyone's fine. I just need to talk to you about some family matters. Can you come this weekend? His tone was strange, almost nervous, like he was reading from a script he hadn't memorized. I should have asked more questions. I should have pressed him for details. Instead, I did what I'd always done. I said yes. That's the pattern, you see. I say yes, I show up, I help, and somehow I still end up invisible. My mother died when I was 19 and Emily was 11. Brain aneurysm. One moment she was making Sunday dinner, the next she was gone. The house we grew up in had been her inheritance from my grandparents passed down to her before she ever married my father. In her will, she left most of it to me with a smaller share for Emily, and the right for my father to live there as long as he needed. I think Dad resented that, though he never said so. What he did say, over and over, was that Emily needed extra love because she'd lost her mother so young, as if I hadn't lost her too, as if 19 was old enough to stop needing your mum. So he poured everything into Emily, every bit of attention, every word of praise, every dollar he could spare. And I became the responsible one, the one who didn't need anything, the one who could handle herself. I handled myself so well that I started paying the property taxes on the house when I was 21. Dad had fallen behind, and rather than let my mother's home go into debt, I quietly took over the payments. I've been paying them for 15 years. He's never once thanked me. I'm not sure he even remembers. I've sent money when Emily needed a new car. I've covered emergency repairs when the roof leaked. I've flown home for every Christmas, every Thanksgiving, every birthday, carrying gifts and desserts, and hope that maybe this time would be different. Every time I watched my father light up when Emily walked into the room. Every time I watched him barely glance at me. Last Thanksgiving, he spent 45 minutes showing everyone the scrapbook Emily had made him. When I mentioned I'd just been promoted to senior consultant, he nodded and said, "That's nice, honey. Emily, tell everyone about your yoga retreat." I stopped expecting recognition years ago, but I never stopped hoping for it. So when Dad called asking me to come home, part of me wondered if this was finally it. Maybe he wanted to acknowledge everything I'd done. Maybe he wanted to say thank you. Maybe after 17 years he was ready to see me. I booked my flight that night and packed my bag with something close to optimism. I didn't know that would be the last time I'd ever see our house the way I remembered it. The flight landed at 4 p.m, and I took a cab straight from the airport. As the familiar streets rolled past my window, I felt that strange mix of comfort and dread that always came with going home. The oak trees lining our neighbourhood had grown so tall over the years. My mother had planted some of them when I was a child. I wondered if anyone in that house even remembered that. When the cab pulled into the driveway, I noticed 2 large suitcases sitting on the front porch. Designer luggage, the kind that costs more than most people's monthly rent. I paid the driver and stepped out my own modest carry-on, feeling suddenly inadequate in comparison. I walked through the front door without knocking. It was still my house after all, even if no one inside seemed to remember that fact. The scene in the living room stopped me in my tracks. Dad and Emily were surrounded by open suitcases, clothes scattered across the couch, shopping bags piled in corners. It looked like they were preparing for a month-long expedition, not a simple family weekend. Emily glanced up from her phone, her fingers still moving across the screen. "Oh, you're here?" She said it the way someone might acknowledge the arrival of a package they hadn't ordered. Dad at least stood up, though his hug was brief and distracted. "Nicole? Good. You made it." His eyes kept drifting back to the chaos of luggage around us. "What's going on?" I asked, setting my bag down by the door. "Are you going somewhere?" Emily's face broke into a brilliant smile, the kind she reserved for moments when she was about to show off. "Daddy's taking me to Paris 2 whole weeks. First-class flights, a suite at the Four Seasons, dinner reservations at restaurants with year-long waiting lists. It's going to be absolutely incredible." I looked at my father. "Paris?" He shrugged, almost sheepish. "Emily's been working so hard lately. She deserves a break." Working hard at what I wanted to ask? Emily hadn't held a steady job in 3 years. Her last attempt at employment had been a brief stint as a social media consultant for her friend's boutique, which ended when she decided the hours interfered with her personal life. But I kept my mouth shut the way I always did. "That sounds wonderful," I managed. "When do you leave?" "Tomorrow morning," Emily said, finally putting her phone down. "Early flight, which reminds me, you can house sit while we're gone. Right, water, the plants, bring in the mail, that sort of thing. You're not doing anything important, are you?" The question hung in the air like an insult dressed as curiosity. You're not doing anything important. As if my career, my life, my responsibilities were all just empty space waiting to be filled by their needs. I thought Dad needed to discuss something with me, I said, turning to him. "You said it was important." Dad waved his hand vaguely. "Right, yes, there are some documents I need you to sign. Nothing complicated. We can handle it in the morning before we head to the airport." "What kind of documents?" He was already turning away, rearranging items in his suitcase. "Just routine stuff, family paperwork. We'll talk about it tomorrow when there's more time." His eyes didn't meet mine. I noticed that. I noticed how his hands seemed to fumble with a shirt he'd already folded twice. I noticed the quick glance he exchanged with Emily so fast I almost missed it. But I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that 17 years of being overlooked had made me suspicious of shadows. Dinner that evening was takeout from Emily's favourite Thai restaurant. I wasn't asked what I wanted. Dad and Emily spent most of the meal discussing their itinerary, the museums they would visit, the shopping districts Emily had researched. I sat across from them eating pad thai I hadn't chosen, feeling like a stranger at my own family table. "The Louvre is an absolute must," Emily was saying, "and the Musée d'Orsay. I've been studying French, you know. I want to be able to order in restaurants without sounding like a tourist." "Your pronunciation is getting so good," Dad said, beaming at her. "Your mother would have been so proud." I set my fork down carefully. My mother had been proud of many things. She'd been proud when I graduated high school as valedictorian. She'd been proud when I got accepted to college on a full scholarship. She'd been proud of the woman I was becoming. But somehow, in this house, her pride had been rewritten to belong only to Emily. After dinner, I retreated to my old bedroom. They'd turned it into a guest room years ago, replacing my furniture with a generic bed and dresser from some catalogue. None of my childhood things remained. It had been erased, just like my place in this family. I tried to sleep, but something kept me restless. Around midnight, I heard sounds from downstairs. Footsteps, heavy ones, moving back and forth. The low murmur of voices. At one point, I could have sworn I heard the rumble of a truck engine outside. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe they were rearranging things for a cleaning service. Maybe they were bringing in more luggage. There were 100 reasonable explanations. So I did what I'd been trained to do in this house. I ignored my instincts. I pushed down the uneasy feeling in my stomach. I closed my eyes and forced myself to drift off, convincing myself that everything was fine. But that night, I dreamed of my mother. She was standing in the living room, surrounded by all her beautiful things, the antique chairs she'd inherited from her grandmother, the hand-carved coffee table my grandfather had made, the crystal vase she'd received as a wedding gift. In the dream, she looked at me with sad eyes and said, "Pay attention, Nicole. Pay attention to what matters." I woke to sunlight streaming through windows that had no curtains, and as I opened my eyes and let the room come into focus, I thought I was still dreaming. The room I woke up in was not the room I had fallen asleep in. That was my first thought, confused and half-formed as I stared at bare walls where curtains had hung the night before. The dresser that had stood against the far wall was gone. The nightstand with its small lamp gone. Even the rug beneath the bed had vanished, leaving only cold hardwood and rectangular dust marks where furniture used to be. I sat up slowly, my heart beginning to pound. Maybe I was still dreaming. Maybe this was some strange continuation of the nightmare about my mother. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, and my feet touched nothing but floor. The small bedside rug my mother had given me years ago, the one with the faded roses she'd picked out herself, had disappeared in the night. I stood and walked to the door, my movements mechanical, my brain refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. The hallway was the same as always, but when I reached the top of the stairs, I stopped breathing. The living room below was empty. Not empty like someone had tidied up, empty like it had been gutted. The couch where I'd sat last night eating Thai food was gone. The armchairs, the coffee table, the bookshelf that had held family photos for as long as I could remember, all of it had vanished. Only the walls remained looking naked and wrong without the paintings that had hung there for decades. I descended the stairs like someone walking through water, each step slow and heavy, and my hand gripped the banister so hard my knuckles went white. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. There had to be an explanation, a reason, something that would make sense of the hollowed-out space that used to be my family home. The kitchen was the same. Cabinets hung open and bare. The table and chairs where we'd eaten countless meals together had been removed. Even the curtains above the sink, the yellow ones my mother had sewn herself, were gone. I opened drawer after drawer, finding nothing but emptiness. And then I saw it. A single piece of paper on the counter, held in place by a coffee mug that had been left behind, perhaps by accident. I picked up the note with trembling hands. My father's handwriting stared back at me, the same cramped letters I'd known my whole life. "Nicole, we needed money for the trip. I sold your things. You don't really use them anyway. Emily deserves this vacation. She's been through so much. You understand, don't you? You always do. We'll talk when we get back. Love, Dad." I read it 3 times. Each time the words meant the same thing, and each time they cut a little deeper. We needed money. I sold your things. Emily deserves this. You understand. You always do. Something cold settled in my chest as I set the note down. I walked back through the house room by room, taking inventory of everything that had been stolen from me, because that's what this was. Theft. They had come into this house in the middle of the night and taken everything I owned while I slept one floor above them. My childhood bookshelf, the one my grandfather had built with his own hands, gone. My mother's antique mirror, the one she used to let me watch her put on makeup when I was small, gone. The chest at the foot of my bed where I kept quilts my grandmother had made, gone. Every piece of furniture, every item of value, every physical memory I had left of the woman who raised me, all of it sold to fund a vacation for the daughter who already had everything. But the worst discovery was still coming. I went to the closet in the hallway, the one where we kept special things, important things, items too precious for everyday display. I already knew what I wouldn't find, but I had to look anyway. I had to see the empty shelf where my mother's wooden keepsake box used to sit. That box had been the last gift my mother gave me before she died. She'd pressed it into my hands during one of her final lucid moments and told me to keep it safe to remember her by it. Inside were her wedding ring locks of hair from when Emily and I were babies, the first letter my father ever wrote her photographs that existed nowhere else in the world. That box was my mother. It was all I had left of her that I could touch. And Emily had sold it. For money. For Paris. I don't know how long I stood there staring at the empty shelf. Time seemed to stop, or maybe I stopped frozen in place while the world continued to spin around me. I kept waiting for the tears to come, for the screaming, for some kind of release that would match the enormity of what had been done to me. But nothing came. Instead, something inside me went very quiet, very still. I thought about 17 years of being the good daughter, 17 years of paying taxes on a house I was barely welcome in, 17 years of sending money that was never acknowledged, showing up to holidays where I was an afterthought, watching my father pour all his love into Emily while I stood in the shadows waiting for scraps. I thought about every time I had said yes when I wanted to say no, every time I had swallowed my pain to keep the peace, every time I had told myself that being family meant accepting being treated as less than. And I realised standing in that empty house that I was done. I wasn't angry. Anger would have been too simple, too clean. What I felt was something deeper and colder, a clarity that cut through the fog of a lifetime of conditioning. They had finally shown me in the most undeniable way possible exactly how much I meant to them. And now I knew. Now I could stop pretending. I walked back to the kitchen and picked up the note again. You understand, don't you? You always do. Yes. I finally understood. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to let it go. But what hurt more than the empty house was the phone call that came next. My phone rang while I was still standing in the kitchen, the note clutched in my hand like evidence at a crime scene. The screen showed my father's name, and for a moment I just stared at it, watching it buzz against my palm. Part of me wanted to let it ring until it went to voicemail, but another part, the part that had spent 36 years trying to understand this family, needed to hear what he would say. I answered. Hello? Nicole? Good morning, sweetheart. His voice was bright and cheerful, the voice of a man on vacation, a man without a care in the world. I could hear airport sounds in the background, announcements over loudspeakers, the hum of crowds moving through terminals. Did you find the papers I left for you? I need you to sign them and mail them to the lawyer. The address is on the envelope. I looked down at the counter. Beside the note was a manila envelope I hadn't noticed before, half hidden beneath the coffee mug. I pulled it out and opened it with one hand while holding the phone with the other. Inside was a legal document several pages thick with yellow tabs marking the places for signatures. What is this? I asked, scanning the first page. Just some routine paperwork, Dad said breezily. Power of attorney stuff. Makes it easier for me to handle things with the house while you're living so far away. You know how complicated these things can be. I read the words in front of me and my blood turned to ice. This wasn't routine paperwork. This was a document giving my father full legal control over the house and all property decisions. If I signed this, I would be signing away my ownership rights, the inheritance my mother had specifically left to me. He would have complete authority to sell the house mortgage, do whatever he wanted without my consent. They had planned this. They had stripped the house while I slept and left these papers for me to sign, expecting me to be so conditioned, so beaten down, that I would just put my name on the dotted line without question. They wanted me to give away my birthright before I even realised what they had taken. The trip is going to be wonderful, Dad continued, oblivious to my silence, or simply not caring. Emily is absolutely glowing. She's been looking forward to this for months. First class is really something else, Nicole. The champagne they serve is top shelf. Dad, my voice came out flat. You sold my furniture. A pause, then a small laugh, dismissive and light. Oh, that, yes. Well, we needed to cover some expenses. You weren't using any of it, sweetheart. That room has been empty for years. I didn't think you'd mind. You didn't think I'd mind. It was just old stuff, Nicole. Things collect dust. Emily found a buyer who took everything at once, very convenient. She handled the whole thing. Here she wants to talk to you. Before I could protest, there was a shuffling sound, and then Emily's voice filled my ear, high and excited. Nicole, did you see we cleared out your room? God, it was such a mess in there. Old books, ugly furniture, stuff that should have been thrown out years ago. You're welcome, by the way. I gripped the phone tighter. That furniture belonged to me. The bookshelf Grandpa built, Mum's mirror, the quilts Grandma made. Those were mine. Emily. She laughed. Actually laughed, the sound bright and careless. Oh my God, stop being so dramatic. It was just old junk. You're never here anyway. What do you need it for? Besides, those first-class tickets weren't cheap. Someone had to pay for them, and it's not like you were using any of that stuff. You had no right to sell my things. Nurse. Your things, Emily's voice took on an edge. Nicole, you moved out 17 years ago. You left all that behind. If you wanted it so bad, you should have taken it with you. Don't blame me because you're a hoarder who can't let go of the past. My hand was shaking now, but my voice stayed steady. What about Mom's keepsake box, the wooden one from her closet? There was a brief pause. What about it? Where is it, Emily? I sold it with everything else. Some antique shop gave me $50 for it. Honestly, I think I got ripped off. The thing was falling apart. $50. My mother's keepsake box with her wedding ring inside, with locks of our baby hair, with photographs that could never be replaced, sold for $50 to a stranger. 17 years of memories, the last physical piece of my mother I could hold in my hands, gone for the price of a mediocre dinner. You should thank me, Emily continued, her voice turning smug. I did you a favour cleaning out all that junk. Now, when you visit the room, will actually be usable. Maybe Daddy will let you have the guest room if you ask nicely. I heard my father's voice in the background saying something about boarding. Emily giggled and said, Gotta go, they're calling our flight. Sign those papers and mail them today. Okay, Daddy needs them processed before we get back. Oh, and water the plants. Bye. The line went dead. I stood in the empty kitchen phone, pressed against my ear, listening to silence. The dial tone eventually kicked in a flat, mechanical sound that matched the emptiness inside me. I lowered the phone and set it on the counter beside the power of attorney documents that would have handed over everything my mother left me. For 17 years, I had cried over this family. I had cried when they forgot my birthday. I had cried when my father walked past my graduation photos to show everyone Emily's participation trophies. I had cried alone in my apartment after holidays, where I was treated like a guest in my own childhood home. I had cried so many tears that I thought there must be an ocean somewhere made entirely of my grief. But standing in that gutted house, holding papers that proved just how calculated their cruelty had been, something shifted. The place inside me where tears usually lived had gone dry and hard. My hands stopped shaking. My breathing slowed. I picked up the power of attorney and read every single word. Then I tore it in half, and in half again, and kept tearing until it was nothing but confetti on the kitchen floor. And for the first time in 17 years, I didn't cry. I started thinking. The torn pieces of the power of attorney lay scattered across the kitchen floor like fallen leaves, and I felt nothing about destroying them. No guilt, no fear, no second-guessing. Just a cold, clear certainty that I would never again sign away pieces of myself to people who saw me as nothing more than a convenience. I walked to the living room and sat down on the bare floor, my back against the wall, where the couch used to be. The afternoon sun streamed through windows that no longer had curtains, casting long rectangles of light across the dusty hardwood. I pulled out my phone and opened the Notes app, and for the first time in my life, I began to tally exactly what I had given this family: property taxes. I started there because the numbers were concrete, undeniable. I had been paying them since I was 21 years old when I discovered my father had fallen 3 years behind and the county was threatening liens. I pulled up my bank records year by year and added them together. 15 years of payments averaging $4,000 annually. $60,000. I had paid $60,000 to maintain a house where my belongings could be sold while I slept. Emergency money came next. The checks I sent when Emily's car broke down. The transfers I made when Dad said the heating system needed repairs. The funds I provided for Emily's failed business ventures, her apartment deposits, her sudden needs that always seemed to arise right before holidays. I scrolled through years of transactions watching the numbers climb. $23,000 in emergency assistance, given freely, never repaid, rarely even acknowledged. Then there were the intangibles, the things that couldn't be measured in dollars but cost me just as much. 17 years of birthday gifts I carefully selected, wrapped and delivered while receiving nothing in return but a card signed as an afterthought. 17 years of holiday meals I helped prepare only to be seated at the far end of the table, away from the conversations that mattered. 17 years of phone calls I initiated that were cut short, visits I planned that were rescheduled around Emily's convenience accomplishments, I shared that were met with distracted nods. I had given this family over $80,000 and countless hours of my life. And, in return, they had sold my mother's keepsake box for $50. But I wasn't finished taking inventory. I opened my banking app and navigated to a savings account I had set up 8 years ago. The Family Emergency Fund, I had called it. A safety net for genuine crises, something my father could access if there was ever a real need. I had contributed $300 every month, building it slowly into what I thought was a cushion of security for the people I loved. The balance showed $47. I stared at the number scrolling back through the transaction history, withdrawals one after another stretching back over the past year. 500 here, 1,000 there, always, in amounts just small enough not to trigger alerts. My father had been draining the account systematically, taking the money I had saved for emergencies and spending it on God knows what. Paris, shopping, probably. First-class champagne. I closed the app and set my phone down on the floor beside me. $83,000 in direct contributions plus whatever had been in that emergency fund before he emptied it. Close to $100,000 total, given to a family that couldn't even let me keep my grandfather's bookshelf. The confetti of the power of attorney seemed almost insufficient now. I had already destroyed it, but the act felt small compared to the magnitude of what I was finally allowing myself to see. They hadn't just betrayed me this morning. They had been betraying me for years, taking and taking and taking, while I smiled and nodded and told myself that family meant sacrifice. Family meant sacrifice. But it wasn't supposed to mean slaughter. I picked up my phone again and scrolled through my contacts until I found a name I hadn't called in months. Sarah Chen. We had been roommates in college back before life pulled us in different directions. She was a family law attorney now, one of the best in the state, handling estate disputes and property cases that made headlines. We had kept in loose touch over the years, occasional texts, on birthdays, likes on social media posts. But I had never asked her for professional help. I had never needed to. I had never allowed myself to need to. The phone rang 3 times before she answered. "Nicole." "Oh my God, it's been forever. How are you?" "Sarah." My voice came out calm, terrifyingly calm even to my own ears. "I need to know my legal rights regarding my mother's estate. The house she left me, the property ownership, all of it. And I need to know today." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Sarah spoke again, the cheerful surprise had been replaced by the focused tone of a professional who recognised urgency. "What happened?" "My father and sister sold everything I own while I slept last night. They're on their way to Paris right now. Before they left, they tried to get me to sign a power of attorney giving my father full control over the house." "Did you sign it?" I looked at the scraps of paper scattered across the kitchen floor. I tore it up. "Good." I could hear her moving the sound of a chair rolling a drawer opening. "Good, Nicole. Don't sign anything they give you. Can you send me copies of your mother's will? Any documents you have about the property ownership?" "I don't have them here. Everything was in the house and they cleaned it out." "That's okay. I can pull the public records. The will should have been filed with the probate court when your mother passed. Give me a few hours to do some research and I'll call you back. What's the address of the property?" I gave her the information, answering her questions in short, clear sentences. She asked about my mother's death, about how the estate had been handled, about whether I had ever formally accepted or declined my inheritance. I told her everything I knew, which wasn't as much as I should have known after 17 years. "Sit tight," Sarah said finally. "Don't leave the house. Don't throw anything away, even if it looks like garbage. And Nicole, whatever you're feeling right now, don't let it push you into doing anything impulsive. Let me find out where you stand legally before you make any moves." I agreed and ended the call. Then I sat in the empty living room watching the sun track slowly across the bare walls and waited. 3 hours later, my phone rang again. What Sarah told me was something my father definitely never wanted me to know. Sarah's voice was different when she called back. Gone was the warmth of an old friend catching up. In its place was the measured tone of a lawyer delivering information that would change everything. "Nicole, I need you to sit down for this." I was already on the floor, my back still against the living room wall. "I'm sitting?" "Good, because what I found in the probate records is significant." I heard papers shuffling on her end. "Your mother's will was filed 17 years ago, right after her death. I have the full document in front of me now. And Nicole, your father has been lying to you." My stomach tightened, but my voice stayed steady. "Tell me." "The house was your mother's separate property. She inherited it from her parents before she ever married your father. Under the law, that means it was hers alone to distribute however she wanted. And according to her will, she left 70% of the property to you." I closed my eyes. 70%. "Yes, Emily received 20%. Your father received nothing. 0 ownership stake. The will grants him lifetime residency rights, meaning he can live there until he dies or voluntarily leaves, but he has no legal claim to the property itself. He can't sell it, can't mortgage it, can't make any decisions about it without the consent of the actual owners, which is you and your sister, with you holding the majority share." The numbers swam in my head. 70%. All these years I had assumed the house belonged to my father, that I was just a guest being tolerated in what was rightfully his domain. I had paid taxes on property I didn't even know was primarily mine. I had sent money for repairs on a house I legally controlled. I had tiptoed around my own inheritance because no one had ever told me the truth. Why didn't I know this? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Your father was named executor of the estate. He was responsible for distributing the assets and informing all beneficiaries of their inheritance. Based on what you've told me, he never did that. He just kept living in the house and let everyone assume it was his. 17 years. For 17 years, my father had hidden my mother's final wishes. He had taken her gift to me and buried it under lies, letting me believe I had no claim, no rights, no standing in the home where I grew up. There's more, Sarah continued. Everything that was sold from that house last night, your furniture, your personal belongings, any items that belonged to you or were part of your inheritance, your father had no legal authority to sell any of it. As a resident with no ownership, he can't dispose of property that belongs to the owners. What he did is legally considered theft or conversion, depending on how you want to frame it. Conversion. It's a legal term for when someone takes your property and treats it as their own, sells it, destroys it, gives it away. Your father converted your belongings into cash for his personal use. That's actionable, Nicole. You could press criminal charges for theft. You could sue him in civil court for the value of everything taken. Given the items you described, including family heirlooms and antiques, you could be looking at significant damages. I thought about my grandfather's bookshelf handmade from oak he had cut himself. My grandmother's quilt stitched over years of patient evenings. My mother's antique mirror passed down through 3 generations. How do you put a dollar value on things like that? How do you calculate the worth of memories that can never be replaced? I could sue him, I said slowly. You absolutely could, and frankly, you'd probably win. The evidence is clear. The will is on record. He had no right to do what he did. I stared at the empty room around me, at the dust outlines where furniture had stood just yesterday. I thought about my father's cheerful voice on the phone, about Emily laughing at my distress, about the power of attorney they had left for me to sign like a lamb being led to slaughter. I don't want to destroy them, I said finally. Sarah paused. What do you mean? I mean, I don't want to sue my father. I don't want to press charges against my sister. That's not what this is about for me. I took a breath, feeling the cold clarity that had settled over me since this morning. I want them to understand what they've done. I want them to face the reality of who they've become and how they've treated me. There's a difference between destruction and accountability. That's a generous distinction, Sarah said quietly. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just not ready to become the villain they've always wanted me to be. I pushed myself up from the floor, suddenly restless. But before I decide anything else, I need to find something. My mother's keepsake box. Emily said she sold it to an antique shop for $50. That box had my mother's wedding ring in it, Sarah. It had photographs, letters, things that can never be replaced. I need to get it back. Do you know which shop? No, but I'm going to find out. Sarah promised to send me copies of all the documents she had found, the will, the probate records, everything I would need if I decided to take legal action later. She told me to call her anytime, day or night, if I needed advice. And then she said something that stayed with me long after we hung up. Nicole, you've spent 17 years being the bigger person. There's no shame in finally being the person with the bigger claim. After the call ended, I grabbed my keys and walked out to my rental car. The evening air was cool and carried the scent of cut grass from a neighbour's yard. Somewhere in this town, my mother's keepsake box was sitting in a shop waiting for a stranger to buy it and take it away forever. I couldn't let that happen. I pulled up a map on my phone and searched for antique stores in the area. There were 5 within a reasonable radius. I started with the closest one, a cluttered shop run by an elderly man who had no record of any wooden box matching my description. The second shop was already closed for the day, lights off and gate pulled down. I started searching for the antique shops in the area. And at the third one, I found something that changed everything. The third shop was called Second Chances Antiques, tucked into a corner of Main Street, between a bakery and a hardware store. The front window was crowded with vintage lamps, old clocks, and porcelain figurines arranged in careful clusters. A small bell chimed when I pushed open the door, announcing my arrival to a shop that smelled of wood polish and old books. Inside the space was organised chaos. Furniture from different eras stood side by side. Victorian armchairs next to mid-century coffee tables, farm tables beneath crystal chandeliers. Every surface held smaller treasures, jewellery-boxed candlesticks, framed photographs of people whose names had probably been forgotten decades ago. This wasn't a junk shop. This was a place where things came to wait for someone who would appreciate them. A woman emerged from behind a tall bookcase, wiping her hands on an apron covered in dust. She was perhaps 65, with silver hair pulled back in a loose bun, and reading glasses perched on her nose. Her eyes were the kind of eyes that had seen grief and come out the other side with compassion intact. "Welcome to Second Chances," she said warmly. "I'm Martha. Can I help you to find something, or are you just browsing?" "I'm looking for something specific," I said, hearing the tension in my own voice. "A wooden keepsake box. It would have been sold to you yesterday or the day before. Dark wood, carved flowers on the lid about this big." I held my hands apart to show the size. Martha's expression shifted. The polite shopkeeper's smile faded into something more thoughtful, more careful. "The one with the family photographs inside." My heart stuttered. "Yes, that's the one." She studied me for a long moment, her eyes moving across my face like she was reading something written there. Then she nodded slowly. "Come with me." I followed her past shelves of dishes and racks of vintage clothing through a doorway covered by a beaded curtain into a back room I hadn't known existed. This space was different from the main shop, quieter, more personal. A single window let in the fading evening light, illuminating a work table covered with items in various states of repair. Along the far wall stood a wooden cabinet with glass doors, and inside I could see a collection of objects that seemed to have no connection except for one thing. Each of them I realised contained photographs. Picture frames, photo albums, boxes with images tucked inside. A gallery of strangers' memories carefully preserved. Martha walked to the cabinet and opened it. "I don't sell things with souls in them," she said softly. "When something comes in with family photos, with evidence that it meant something to someone, I keep it here. I clean it up, I keep it safe, and I wait." "Well, wait for what?" She turned to look at me, and her eyes were full of understanding. "For someone like you to come looking." From the cabinet, she lifted my mother's keepsake box. The sight of it struck me like a physical blow. I remembered sitting on my mother's bed as a child, watching her open that lid, showing me the treasures inside. "This is where we keep the important things," she used to say. "The things that tell our story." "I lost my daughter 10 years ago," Martha said quietly, placing the box in my hands. "Cancer. She was 32. After she passed, I realised how few of her things I had kept. I had given so much away over the years, not understanding that one day those objects would be all I had left of her." She paused, adjusting her glasses. "Since then, when something like this comes into my shop, I can't bring myself to sell it. Someone always comes looking eventually. You're the third person I've reunited with their memories this year." I held the box against my chest, feeling the weight of it, the realness of it. "Thank you," I managed. "You have no idea what this means to me." "I think I do," she said gently. "That's why I kept it." I sat down on a small stool near the work table and carefully opened the lid. Everything was still there. The family photographs, slightly faded now but intact. A bundle of dried flowers tied with a ribbon that had once been pink. My baby bracelet from the hospital, the tiny beads spelling out my name. A lock of hair, fine and golden, from my first haircut. Each item was a doorway to a memory I thought I had lost forever. "There's something else," Martha said, watching me. I noticed it when I was cleaning the box, but I didn't open it. It wasn't my story to read. I looked up at her. "What do you mean?" She leaned forward and pointed to the bottom of the box, to what looked like solid wood. "Press there, on the left side. There's a hidden compartment." Shush. My fingers found a small latch I had never noticed in all my years of looking through this box. I pressed it, and a thin drawer slid out from beneath the main compartment. Inside was a single envelope yellowed with age, the paper soft from years of being hidden away. My name was written on the front. Nicole, in my mother's handwriting. I picked up the envelope with trembling hands. It was light, containing just a few pages at most. But what stopped my breath was not the weight of it. It was the condition of the seal. The envelope had already been opened. Someone had taken a letter my dying mother had written to me, read it, and then hidden it in a secret compartment where I would never find it. Someone had kept my mother's final words from me for 17 years. I looked at the handwriting again, at the careful way she had formed each letter of my name. She had wanted me to have this. She had hidden it somewhere special, somewhere meaningful, trusting that I would find it one day, and someone had intercepted it. "Are you all right?" Martha asked softly. I couldn't answer. I was staring at the opened envelope at the evidence of a betrayal far deeper than furniture or money or property. This was my mother's voice stolen from me before I ever knew it existed. Someone had read this letter before me, and they had kept it hidden for 17 years. Martha offered me a cup of tea and a quiet corner of her shop to read the letter. I think she understood that whatever I was about to discover needed space and privacy. She disappeared into the front room without another word, leaving me alone with my mother's handwriting and 17 years of buried truth. I slid the pages out of the envelope carefully, as if they might crumble at my touch. The paper was thin, the kind my mother always used for important correspondence. Her handwriting was weaker than I remembered the letters, formed with effort by a hand that was already failing. She must have written this near the end, when she knew she was running out of time. "My dearest Nicole," the letter began. I read each word slowly, hearing my mother's voice in my head, soft and warm, the way it had been when she would read to me at bedtime. "I know you will be the strong one. You have always been strong, even when you didn't realize it. You carry burdens without complaint, you give without expecting return, and you love with a depth that most people never achieve. These are gifts, my darling, but they are also vulnerabilities. The world will try to take advantage of your strength. Some people will mistake your kindness for weakness. Do not let them." Tears were already blurring my vision, but I kept reading. "I am leaving you the larger share of the house because I trust you to use it wisely. This home has been in our family for 3 generations, and I know you will honor that legacy. Your father means well, but he doesn't always see things clearly. He doesn't see how much you already give to this family, how much you sacrificed without recognition. I have tried to tell him, but some truths are hard for people to hear about themselves." My hands were shaking now, making the paper tremble. "Please watch over Emily. She is young and I worry about her. She has grown up expecting love to come easily, expecting things to be given without being earned. This is partly my fault and partly your father's. She needs to learn that love isn't about things, that it isn't measured by gifts or trips or material possessions. She needs to learn to stand on her own feet, and I'm afraid I won't be here to teach her. Be patient with her, Nicole. But also, be honest with her, even when honesty is difficult." There was more on the second page. I turned it over with trembling fingers. "I have written letters to Emily and your father as well. Emily's letter explains what I hope for her, how I want her to grow into a woman who earns her own way in the world. Your father's letter asks him to treat you both fairly, to see you for who you are, rather than who he imagines you to be. I have also written to your Aunt Ruth, asking her to watch over this family and make sure my wishes are honoured." The next line hit me like a blow to the chest. "Please make sure they receive their letters. The box holds all the truth our family needs. When I am gone, this box will be my voice. Let it speak for me." I set the letter down and stared at the wall, unable to breathe. My mother had written letters to everyone. She had left final words for Emily, for my father, for Aunt Ruth. She had trusted me to deliver them, to make sure her voice continued even after she was gone. But I had never received this letter. I had never known these other letters existed, which meant someone else had found them first. The opened envelope sat beside me like an accusation. Someone had discovered this hidden compartment before me. Someone had read my mother's final wishes, her hopes for her family, her trust in me to carry out her legacy, and that someone had chosen to bury it all. There was only one person it could have been. My father had found these letters 17 years ago. He had read them, all of them, including the one meant for him, that asked him to treat his daughters fairly. He had learned that my mother wanted me to have the larger share of the house, that she trusted me more than she trusted him to honour our family legacy. And instead of accepting her wishes, instead of honouring the woman he claimed to love, he had hidden everything. He had taken my mother's voice and silenced it. Every moment of favouritism over the past 17 years suddenly looked different. Every time he had overlooked me, dismissed me, treated Emily like the only daughter who mattered. It hadn't been unconscious bias or grief-driven blindness. It had been deliberate. He knew what my mother wanted. He knew she had seen his tendency to spoil Emily, his failure to appreciate me. And rather than change, rather than become the man his dying wife asked him to be, he had buried the evidence and continued exactly as before. The furniture didn't matter anymore. The money didn't matter. Even the keepsake box, precious as it was, paled in comparison to this revelation. My father hadn't just failed to see me. He had actively chosen to erase my mother's recognition of me. He had stolen her words, her wishes, her final gift to her eldest daughter. And Emily had never received her letter either. The letter that might have helped her grow, that might have taught her the lessons my mother wanted her to learn. My father had kept that from her too, leaving her to become exactly the person my mother had feared she would become. I gathered the pages and slid them back into the envelope. My tears had dried, replaced by something harder and colder. I thought about my father laughing on the phone from the airport. I thought about Emily dismissing my mother's keepsake box as ugly junk. They had no idea what they had done, or maybe they did, and simply didn't care. I wanted to call him right then. I wanted to scream the truth across the ocean, to shatter his vacation with the weight of his own lies. But rage makes mistakes. Rage acts without thinking. And I was done being the person who reacted. I was going to be the person who planned. But I wasn't going to confront him yet. First, I needed to know how deep the damage went. Sarah called me the next morning while I was sitting at the kitchen counter, my mother's letter spread out before me like a map to a past I had never known. I had barely slept, spending most of the night reading and rereading those pages, letting my mother's words sink into the places where 17 years of doubt had lived. "Nicole, I found something," Sarah said, her voice carrying that particular edge it got when she was about to deliver complicated news. "I've been doing some deeper research into your family's financial situation, trying to get a complete picture before we decide how to proceed. And I came across something you need to know about." I set down my coffee cup. "What is it?" "Your sister has significant debt? Credit card debt specifically. I found records of at least 5 different accounts in her name, all of them maxed out, most of them delinquent. The total comes to just over $30,000. $30,000. I let the number settle in my mind, trying to reconcile it with the image of Emily laughing about first-class champagne and designer shopping bags. How is that possible? She doesn't have any income. That's the problem. She's been living off credit for years, apparently. Minimum payments here and there, balance transfers to buy time, the usual spiral. But she's reached the end of the line. Several of these accounts have been sent to collection agencies. They're actively pursuing her." I thought about Emily's social media posts, the constant photos of expensive restaurants and boutique shopping trips, the image of a perfect life carefully curated for an audience that had no idea it was all built on borrowed money. She had been performing success while drowning in debt. "There's more," Sarah continued. "The largest account, about $18,000, has a co-signer. Your father." My stomach dropped. He co-signed as guarantor, which means if Emily defaults, and it looks like she's already in default, the credit card company can come after him for the full amount. His credit is at risk, and depending on how aggressive they get, potentially some of his assets too. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the empty backyard. My father had signed away his financial security for Emily, probably without even reading the paperwork. He would have just seen his younger daughter asking for help, would have believed whatever story she told him about needing a safety net, and he would have scribbled his name without question. Because that's what he did. He gave Emily everything she asked for and never stopped to wonder if it was wise. Does he know? I asked. About the debt, the collections, any of it? I doubt it. The notices are being sent to Emily's address, not his. She's probably been hiding it from him, hoping to figure something out before he finds out. The Paris trip suddenly made terrible sense. It wasn't a celebration. It was a last gasp of denial, a final, extravagant gesture before reality came crashing down. Emily knew the walls were closing in. She knew the collectors were calling, the accounts were frozen, the house of cards was about to collapse. And instead of facing it, instead of asking for help or making a plan, she had convinced my father to sell my belongings and fund one more fantasy vacation. She was running from the truth, and my father, blind as always, was helping her run. What happens if she doesn't pay? I asked. Eventually, they'll sue. They'll get a judgment against her and probably against your father as co-signer. Wage garnishment if she ever gets a job. Liens on property damaged credit for years. It's not a quick process, but it's relentless. They don't give up. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on me. Part of me, the wounded part that had spent 17 years being overlooked and undervalued, wanted to let it happen. Let them face the consequences of their choices. Let Emily's perfect illusion shatter. Let my father finally see what his favoritism had created. But another part of me, the part that could still hear my mother's voice in that letter, wouldn't let me walk away. Watch over Emily, my mother had written. Be patient with her, but also be honest with her even when honesty is difficult. Emily didn't need another person enabling her. She didn't need more money thrown at problems she had created. But she also didn't need to be destroyed. She needed to face reality, probably for the first time in her adult life. She needed to understand that actions have consequences, that debt doesn't disappear just because you ignore it, that you can't build a life on other people's resources forever. And my father needed to see what he had done, not just to me, but to Emily. His endless indulgence hadn't helped her. It had crippled her. He had raised a woman who couldn't function without someone else paying her way, who ran from problems instead of solving them, who genuinely believed she deserved luxury while standing in the middle of financial ruin. I could let them crash, I said quietly. You could, Sarah agreed. No one would blame you after what they have done. But my mother asked me to watch over Emily. Even now, even after everything, I can't just ignore that. There was a pause on the line. So what do you want to do? I turned away from the window and looked at the letter on the counter. My mother's handwriting, her final words, her trust in me to do the right thing. She had believed I was strong enough to carry this family. She had believed I could be honest even when honesty was difficult. It was time to prove her right. I'm not going to rescue them, I said. I'm not going to pay Emily's debts or pretend none of this happened. But I'm also not going to let them self-destruct without ever understanding why. They need to see the truth. All of it. The letters, the debt, the lies, everything. And how do you plan to do that? I thought about the empty house around me, about the 14 days I had before they returned from Paris. 14 days to prepare, 14 days to plan. I decided they would face the truth. But it would happen on my terms, in my way. The next 4 days became a blur of activity, each hour filled with purpose I hadn't felt in years. Sarah overnighted me a packet of legal documents, confirming my ownership stake in the house, complete with certified copies of my mother's will, property records, and a formal letter asserting my rights as the majority owner. I read every page twice, letting the legal language sink in. This house was mine. Not emotionally, not sentimentally, but legally and undeniably mine. Armed with that knowledge, I started making calls. The first was to a locksmith. I explained that I was the primary owner of the property and needed new locks installed on all exterior doors. He asked no questions beyond requesting to see the deed, which I had ready. By the end of day 4, every lock in the house had been replaced. I stood in the entryway, holding a set of fresh keys, feeling something shift inside me. This was what control felt like. The second call was to a security company. I arranged for a basic system with cameras at the front and back doors, motion sensors in the main rooms, and a control panel with a code that only I would know. The technicians finished the installation in a single afternoon, walking me through how to access footage remotely, how to change settings, how to monitor the property from anywhere in the world. That evening, I sat down at the kitchen counter and composed a careful email to my father. I explained that as the majority owner of the property, I had made some security upgrades in his absence. I attached photos of the new keys and provided the alarm codes. I told him these changes were for everyone's protection and that I looked forward to discussing the house further when he returned. I kept the tone neutral, almost professional. I wanted him to read it and wonder what else I knew. The third call was to a cleaning crew. 4 women arrived the next morning with mops and vacuums and an arsenal of supplies. They scrubbed floors, wiped windows, cleaned carpets, erased the dust outlines where furniture had stood for decades. By the time they left, the empty rooms looked less like crime scenes and more like blank canvases waiting to be filled. Day 6 brought the painters. I chose warm colours for the main room, soft grey for the living room, pale blue for the kitchen, cream for the hallways. Colours my mother would have loved, colours that made the house feel alive again instead of abandoned. I watched them work, transforming walls that had looked the same for as long as I could remember. This was still my family home. But it was becoming my home now too. Between the workers and the deliveries, I began the process of tracking down my stolen belongings. Sarah had helped me compile a list of items based on what I could remember, and I started calling antique shops, second-hand stores, and online marketplace sellers in the area. Most of my things had been sold to dealers who had already resold them to individual buyers. But with persistence and some luck, I found names and phone numbers. The conversations were difficult at first. I had to explain over and over that my furniture had been sold without my knowledge or consent. Some people were skeptical, others were sympathetic. But when I provided documentation, when they saw the police report I had filed for the record, most of them were willing to help. One woman had purchased my grandmother's quilts. She returned them without asking for reimbursement, saying she had felt something was wrong when the seller seemed so eager to offload them. Another buyer had my mother's antique mirror and agreed to sell it back to me at the same price he had paid. Piece by piece, I reassembled what had been taken. Not everything could be recovered. Some items had already been resold to unknown buyers lost forever in the stream of commerce. But enough came back to make the house feel like mine again. The most meaningful recovery came on day 7. A woman named Patricia called me after seeing a post I had made on a community board. She had my grandfather's bookshelf, the one he had built with his own hands from oak trees on his property. "Your sister told me you were dead," Patricia said, her voice tight with anger. "She said she was cleaning out your things because you had passed away suddenly. I bought the bookshelf because I felt sorry for her. I thought I was helping a grieving family." I closed my eyes, absorbing another layer of Emily's deception. "I'm very much alive. I can see that now. I'm so sorry for what happened to you. Please come get your bookshelf. I won't take a penny for it." I drove to Patricia's house that afternoon and loaded the bookshelf into a rented truck. She helped me carry it, asking questions about my family, shaking her head at each answer. When we finished, she hugged me, a stranger offering comfort that my own sister had never provided. Back at the house, I placed the bookshelf in the living room where it had always belonged. I ran my hands over the wood my grandfather had shaped, feeling the grooves and imperfections that made it unique. This piece of furniture had survived his death, my grandmother's death, my mother's death. It had survived my father's betrayal and my sister's lies. and now it was home again. With the main rooms taking shape, I turned my attention to a different kind of preparation. The guest room at the end of the hall had always been Emily's room when she visited, though she rarely bothered to come. I stood in the doorway looking at the empty space and began to plan. This room would not be filled with recovered furniture or fresh paint. This room would hold something else entirely. It would hold the truth. I began gathering materials, copies of Emily's credit card statements printed from the records Sarah had obtained, the collection notices that had been piling up, a timeline of her debt showing how it had grown over the years, while she posted photos of luxury and ease. I added copies of my mother's letter, both the one written to me and the references to letters Emily had never received. I included photographs of our childhood images of two sisters who had once been close before everything went wrong. Not punishment, I reminded myself as I arranged each item. Perspective. Emily had spent her entire adult life avoiding reality. She had never been forced to look at the consequences of her choices. She had always had someone to rescue her, someone to blame, someone to pay the bills while she pretended everything was fine. That room would hold everything Emily needed to see who she'd really become. I spent 2 full days on Emily's room, and every hour of that work felt like a conversation with my mother. Not angry, not vengeful, but purposeful. My mother had asked me to watch over Emily, to be patient, but also honest. This room would be my honesty. It would be the mirror Emily had been avoiding for her entire adult life. I started with the basics. Fresh paint in a soft sage green, the colour Emily had loved as a teenager before she decided everything had to be designer and expensive. A comfortable bed with clean white linens. A plush armchair in the corner with a reading lamp beside it. Curtains that let in natural light but could be drawn for privacy. If you walked into this room without looking closely, you would see a welcoming guest space, a place designed for rest and reflection. But the details told a different story. On the desk beneath the window, I arranged Emily's financial records in neat folders. The credit card statements came first, organised by account, each one showing the progression from reasonable balances to maxed out limits. I had highlighted the interest charges, the late fees, the minimum payments that barely touched the principal. Beside those folders sat the collection notices, some of them threatening legal action, others offering settlement options that Emily had clearly ignored. A calculator sat nearby with a note showing the total $30,247. The real cost of pretending everything was fine. I placed a legal summary Sarah had prepared explaining what happens when debts go to judgment. Wage garnishment, liens on property, damaged credit that follows you for years. Emily had probably never thought about any of this. She had been taught that consequences were for other people, that someone would always step in to save her. This room would teach her otherwise. The hardest item to place was my mother's letter. I had found it in the keepsake box, tucked into the same secret compartment where my own letter had been hidden. A separate envelope sealed with my mother's handwriting, spelling out Emily's name. Unlike my letter, this one had never been opened. My father had hidden it without even reading it, perhaps assuming it contained the same message as mine, perhaps not caring what his dying wife wanted to tell her younger daughter. I had debated whether to open it myself. In the end, I decided Emily deserved to be the first one to read her mother's final words to her. But I had held the envelope up to the light, trying to see through the paper, and I had caught fragments of sentences, enough to know the general tone. I placed the envelope on the pillow, positioned so it would be the first thing Emily saw when she entered the room. On a small card beside it, I wrote, "Mum wrote this for you 17 years ago. Dad hid it. You deserve to finally read it." Next came the video. I had spent hours the night before searching through old family recordings, digitized files I had saved years ago from deteriorating tapes. Most of them were mundane birthday parties and holiday dinners, the ordinary moments that make up a life. But one recording had stopped me cold. Emily's 12th birthday, just 4 months after our mother died. The video showed a small celebration in the backyard. Just me, Emily, and Dad. Emily was blowing out candles on a homemade cake I had baked because no one else remembered to order one. After the candles, someone handed her the camera and she turned it on herself, her young face filling the frame. "I want to say something," 12-year-old Emily announced, her voice high and earnest. "Nicole is the best sister in the whole world. She made my cake and she wrapped her all my presents, and she always takes care of me. When I grow up, I want to be just like her." Watching that video, I had cried for the first time since finding the empty house. Not tears of anger or betrayal, but grief for the relationship we had lost for the sister Emily had once wanted to become for the woman she might have been if our father had listened to our mother instead of burying her wisdom in a secret compartment. I set up my laptop on the desk, the video cued and ready to play. Emily would see her own face, hear her own voice, remember the person she used to be. The contrast to who she had become would speak louder than any accusation I could make. Finally, I hung the photographs. I had gathered pictures from throughout our lives' images I had saved or recovered from the boxes my father hadn't managed to sell. I arranged them chronologically on one wall, a timeline of two sisters growing up together. In the early photos, we were inseparable, holding hands, sharing toys, laughing at the camera. But as the years progressed, a pattern emerged. There was Emily at her high school graduation, front and centre, beaming at the camera. I was visible in the background, partially obscured by another relative. There was Emily's college send-off party, surrounded by gifts and well-wishers. I had taken the photo invisible behind the lens. There were holiday after holiday, where Emily sat beside our father, opening presents, receiving praise, while I hovered at the edges of the frame, always present, but never seen. I wasn't arranging these photos to shame Emily. I was arranging them to tell the truth, to show her what our family had become, how the patterns had developed, how she had grown accustomed to the spotlight while I faded into the background. Maybe she had never noticed. Maybe she had been so comfortable with my invisibility that she genuinely didn't see it. This room would make her see. When I finished, I stood in the doorway and surveyed my work. The room was beautiful and terrible at the same time. It was a gift wrapped in truth, a space designed not for punishment but for awakening. My mother had asked me to be patient with Emily, but also honest. This room was the most honest thing I had ever created. I closed the door and walked back down the hall to the living room where my grandfather's bookshelf stood against the freshly painted wall. The house was almost ready. The stage was almost set. But there was still one piece missing. 7 more days until they returned. And I had one more person to contact. Aunt Ruth had been close to my mother. She had been mentioned in the hidden letters as someone my mother trusted, someone she had written to as well. If my father had hidden letters from me and Emily, he had probably hidden one from Ruth too. She deserved to know the truth. And more than that, I needed a witness. Someone who could confirm that what I was about to reveal was real, that I wasn't the one rewriting history. I picked up my phone and found Aunt Ruth's number in my contacts. We hadn't spoken in months, maybe longer. She had always been kind to me, but distant, the way extended family sometimes becomes when they don't want to get involved in conflicts they sense, but don't understand. I wondered if she had noticed the favoritism over the years. I wondered if she had ever questioned why I seemed to fade further and further from the family picture. It was time to find out. Before I could call Aunt Ruth, Emily called me, but not for the reason I expected. I had been watching her social media all week, unable to look away from the spectacle of it. Every few hours, a new post appeared. Emily posing in front of the Eiffel Tower at sunset. Emily holding shopping bags from stores whose names I recognised only from magazine advertisements. Emily and Dad clinking champagne glasses at a restaurant where a single meal probably cost more than most people's weekly groceries. The captions were almost unbearable in their obliviousness. Living my best life with the best dad ever, #blessed, #daddy's girl, #Paris love. When your father surprises you with first class and then takes you shopping on the Champs-Élysées, I must have been a saint in a past life. Some girls dream about Paris. I'm actually here. Sorry, not sorry. Each post collected hundreds of likes and comments from friends who had no idea the trip was funded by selling my belongings. They saw glamour and luxury. They didn't see the empty house, the stolen memories, the sister who woke up to find her childhood erased for the price of designer handbags. The disconnect from reality was staggering. Emily was $30,000 in debt. Collection agencies were circling. Her financial life was in ruins. And there she was, photographing croissants at sidewalk cafes and tagging luxury brands like a paid influencer. When my phone rang and her name appeared on the screen, I almost didn't answer. But something told me this call would be important, that I needed to hear whatever she was about to say. Nicole. Oh my God, finally, I've been trying to reach you. She hadn't tried to reach me once since they left. Not a single call or text since the airport conversation, where she laughed about selling my mother's keepsake box. But Emily had always been good at rewriting history to suit her needs. What do you want, Emily? Okay, so I need a tiny favour. Her voice was bright and casual, as if she were asking to borrow a cup of sugar. Daddy's credit card got declined at this amazing boutique we found, and there's this Chanel bag that's absolutely perfect, like it was made for me. Can you transfer like $2,000? I'll pay you back, obviously. I held the phone away from my face and stared at it genuinely, unsure if I had heard correctly. She was calling me from Paris on a trip funded by stealing my possessions to ask me for $2,000 for a handbag. Emily, you can't be serious. What? It's not that much. You have money. You're always bragging about your job and your promotions. Consider it a family loan. I had never bragged about anything to Emily. I had barely mentioned my career to anyone in the family because no one ever asked. The irony of her accusation was almost funny, except nothing about this situation was funny anymore. No, I said. The word hung in the air between us, travelling across the ocean through cell towers and satellites, landing in a Paris boutique where my sister stood surrounded by things she couldn't afford. What do you mean? No, I'm not sending you money. There was a pause. I could almost hear Emily's brain struggling to process this unfamiliar response. In our entire lives, I had never refused her anything. Money, time, attention, support. I had given it all freely without complaint, without expectation of return. The word no simply didn't exist in my vocabulary when it came to Emily. Until now. You're kidding, right? Her voice had shifted the bright casualness, replaced by something sharper. Nicole, I need this bag. It's limited edition. If I don't buy it today, someone else will get it. Then someone else will get it. Are you seriously being this petty over what some old furniture I told you weren't using it anyway? You're acting like we committed a crime or something. I thought about Sarah's legal assessment. Theft, conversion, actionable offences with real consequences. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I stayed calm, my voice steady and quiet. I'm not sending you money, Emily. That's my final answer. The explosion came faster than I expected. You are so selfish. You always have been. You sit there in your fancy apartment with your fancy job, and you can't even help your own sister when she needs it. What is wrong with you? The irony was breathtaking. My sister standing in Paris on a trip paid for with my stolen belongings, calling me selfish because I wouldn't fund her designer handbag purchase. This was the reality of Emily's world. She had been so thoroughly coddled, so completely protected from consequences, that she genuinely believed she was the victim in this situation. I know exactly what's wrong with me, Emily. My voice remained calm, almost serene. And you'll understand too when you come home. What's that supposed to mean? It means I'll see you in 6 days. Nicole, wait. I don't understand what you're... I ended the call. My hands weren't shaking this time. I felt no anger, no hurt, no desperate need for her to understand or apologize. I just felt certain that what I was doing was right, that the confrontation waiting at the end of their vacation was necessary, that Emily needed to see the truth, even if it destroyed the fantasy she had built around herself. 2 hours later, a text arrived from my father. "Your sister is upset. She's been crying for an hour. Would it kill you to help family? For once, I don't understand why you have to be so difficult, Nicole. Emily deserves nice things too." For once. Would it kill you to help family for once? I read the message 3 times, letting each word sink into my chest like small, precise wounds. For once. As if the past 17 years had never happened. As if I hadn't paid the taxes on his house. Funded his emergencies, shown up for every holiday, given everything I had to a family that gave nothing back. For once. My father genuinely believed I was the difficult one. He genuinely believed Emily deserved nice things, that I had money to spare, that my refusal to fund a $2,000 handbag was an act of cruelty, rather than a reasonable boundary. I didn't respond to his text. There was nothing to say that wouldn't be better. Said in person, face to face with evidence spread across a room he would soon have to enter. Instead, I went back to preparing. I had a call to make to Aunt Ruth, witnesses to gather truth searches to arrange. The countdown continued. Emily hung up, still believing she was the victim. She had no idea that in 6 days she would finally have to look in the mirror. Aunt Ruth answered on the second ring, her voice warm and slightly surprised. We hadn't spoken in nearly a year, our contact limited to occasional comments on each other's social media posts and brief exchanges at family gatherings where she always seemed to be watching from the edges. "Nicole, what a lovely surprise. How are you, sweetheart?" I skipped the small talk. There wasn't time for it, and I wasn't in the mood. "Aunt Ruth, I need to ask you something important. Did Mum ever mention writing letters before she died?" The silence that followed lasted long enough for me to hear my own heartbeat. When Ruth finally spoke, her voice had changed. The warmth remained, but underneath it was something else. Something that sounded like old guilt finally finding its way to the surface. "She told me she was writing them." Ruth's words came slowly, carefully, as if she were handling fragile objects she had kept hidden for years. "She called me about a week before she passed. She said she was putting her thoughts down for everyone, making sure we all knew how she felt, what she wanted for the family. She was worried, Nicole. Worried about how Richard would handle things, worried about Emily, worried about you having to carry too much weight." My throat tightened. "Did you ever receive your letter?" "No. After the funeral, I asked your father about them. He said there weren't any letters. He said Susan must have been confused near the end, that the medication was affecting her mind. I believed him." Her voice cracked slightly. "I shouldn't have believed him. I knew Susan. She wasn't confused. She was the clearest thinker I've ever known, right up until her last breath." "He hid them," I said. "All of them." "I found Mum's keepsake box a few days ago. There was a secret compartment inside. The letters were there. Aunt Ruth. She wrote to me, to Emily, to Dad, and I'm guessing to you as well. He found them, and he buried them for 17 years. The sound that came through the phone was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. "Oh, Nicole. Oh, honey. Are you sure? I have my letter in front of me right now. Mum's handwriting. She talks about the others, tells me to make sure everyone receives them. But the envelope had already been opened when I found it. Someone read it before me and decided I shouldn't see it." Ruth was crying now, soft sounds of grief mixed with anger. "I noticed things over the years, you know. The way Richard treated you compared to Emily. The way you were always on the outside looking in. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. I told myself he was doing his best, that grief affects people differently, that maybe I was seeing things that weren't there. You weren't imagining it. I know that now. I should have spoken up. I should have said something, done something. But I was a coward, Nicole. I didn't want to cause trouble in the family. I didn't want to be the difficult sister-in-law who stirred up drama. So I stayed quiet and I watched you disappear, and I told myself it would work out somehow. She paused to compose herself. I'm so sorry. I failed you. I failed Susan. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of her confession settle over me. Another person who had seen the truth and chosen silence. Another adult who could have intervened and didn't. But unlike my father, Ruth's silence came from misguided caution, not deliberate cruelty. She had been wrong, but she had not been malicious. I need your help, I said. Dad and Emily are coming back from Paris in 5 days. I've arranged some things at the house, prepared some truths they need to face, but I can't do it alone. I need witnesses, people who can confirm what's real when they try to deny it or rewrite history. Whatever you need. I'll be there. I'm inviting a few other relatives as well. Cousin Margaret and Uncle David. People who've known this family long enough to understand what's been happening, even if they haven't talked about it openly. Ruth agreed without hesitation. I gave her the date and time, explaining. It would be framed as a welcome home dinner, a casual family gathering. I told her enough to prepare her for what was coming, but not the full scope of what I had planned. Some things needed to be experienced to be believed. After hanging up with Ruth, I made 2 more calls. Margaret, my mother's niece, had always been kind to me, in ways that felt deliberate, as if she were trying to compensate for something she couldn't name. She accepted the invitation immediately and asked if I was okay. I told her I would be soon. Uncle David was my father's younger brother, a quiet man who rarely got involved in family matters. But he had loved. My mother had given one of the readings at her funeral and had once told me I had her eyes. He agreed to come, though I heard questions in his silence that he was too polite to ask. With the witnesses confirmed, I turned to the final piece of preparation, the presentation. I didn't want drama for its own sake. I didn't want screaming matches or accusations that could be deflected with denials. I wanted facts, undeniable, documented, impossible to dismiss facts that would speak for themselves. I gathered the photographs I had taken of the empty house room by room the morning after the theft. I printed copies of my mother's will highlighting the ownership percentages in yellow. I made copies of the letters, my mother's handwriting unmistakable. I organised everything into a simple folder, ordered logically building a case, the way Sarah might build an argument in court. This was not about humiliation. Emily would face her truths privately in the room I had prepared. But the family, the witnesses, they needed to understand what had happened. They needed to see the evidence so that when my father tried to minimise or excuse or explain away, there would be people in the room who knew the reality. I rehearsed what I would say, standing alone in the living room, my grandfather's bookshelf watching over me like a guardian. I practiced keeping my voice calm, my points clear, my emotions controlled. I had spent 17 years being the daughter who swallowed her pain to keep the peace. Now I would be the daughter who spoke the truth, to break a different kind of silence. The night before they returned, I walked through the house one final time. Fresh paint on the walls, new locks on the doors, recovered furniture in its proper place. The truth room, waiting at the end of the hall, Emily's letter on the pillow. Everything was ready. I barely slept. My mind kept spinning through scenarios, imagining their faces when they walked through the door, when they saw what I had done, when they realised the power dynamic had shifted forever. The day they returned, I stood at the front door, not as the forgotten daughter, but as the rightful owner of this house and my own story. I heard the car before I saw it, the familiar rumble of my father's sedan coming down the street, slowing as it approached the driveway. I stood at the living room window, watching through the sheer curtains as they pulled in, jet-lagged and oblivious to what waited for them inside. The car doors opened and they emerged, both of them loaded with shopping bags. Designer logos I recognised from Emily's social media posts adorned the sides of carriers stuffed with tissue paper and expensive purchases. My father stretched his back, tired from the long flight. Emily was already on her phone, probably posting about being home. Then they looked at the house. Emily stopped mid-step, her phone lowering slowly. My father's mouth fell open slightly, his eyes scanning the front of the property as if trying to confirm he had pulled into the right driveway. The house they had left 2 weeks ago was not the house standing before them now. Fresh paint in warm grey tones had replaced the faded white that had been peeling for years. The overgrown bushes I had hired someone to trim were now neat and shaped, framing the walkway. New outdoor lighting fixtures gleamed beside the door, and above them, visible, but not aggressive, the small cameras of the security system watched silently. The house looked cared for. It looked loved. It looked nothing like the neglected property they had abandoned. They approached the front door, slowly, shopping bags hanging forgotten at their sides. Emily reached the door, first pulling out her key with the confident motion of someone who has done it 1,000 times. She inserted it into the lock and turned. Nothing happened. She tried again, jiggling the key, pushing harder. The lock didn't budge. "Nicole!" Her voice was sharp with irritation as she banged on the door. "The lock is broken. Let us in." I counted to 3, letting her knock again, letting the frustration build. Then I opened the door. Emily's face shifted through several emotions in rapid succession. Surprise at seeing me standing there calmly. Confusion at the interior visible behind me clearly changed from what she remembered. And then, something harder, something defensive, as her brain began to register that things were not as she expected. "The lock works fine," I said, my voice even and controlled. "I changed it. I sent Dad the new keys and codes in an email 2 weeks ago. Didn't you get it?" My father patted his pockets reflexively, then seemed to remember he had barely looked at email during the trip. "I might have missed it," he mumbled. "We were busy." "I'm sure you were." I stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. "Please come in." They walked past me into the foyer, and I watched their faces as they took in the transformation. The fresh paint continued inside soft colours that made the space feel larger and brighter. The recovered furniture was arranged thoughtfully, my grandfather's bookshelf standing proud against the far wall. The hardwood floors had been cleaned and polished, gleaming under the new light fixtures I had installed. But it was the living room that made them stop completely. Aunt Ruth sat in the armchair by the window, her hands folded in her lap, her expression carefully neutral. Cousin Margaret was on the sofa, and Uncle David stood near the fireplace, his arms crossed over his chest. They all looked up when my father and Emily entered, and no one smiled. "Ruth," my father's voice cracked slightly, "what are you doing here?" "Nicole invited me," Aunt Ruth said simply. "She invited all of us." Emily dropped her shopping bags on the floor, her face flushing with something between confusion and anger. "What is all this? Why is everyone here? Is this supposed to be some kind of surprise party?" I closed the front door behind them, the sound of the latch clicking into place somehow final. "Not a party, a family meeting. There are some things we need to discuss." My father was looking around the room, taking in the furniture, the photographs on the walls, the obvious care that had been put into every detail. His face had gone pale, the tan from 2 weeks in Paris, fading before my eyes as blood drained from his cheeks. "Where did all this come from?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I bought most of it back," I said. "The things you sold while I slept, my furniture, my belongings, items that weren't yours to sell. It took some effort, but I managed to recover almost everything." Emily let out a sharp laugh, too loud and too forced. "Oh my God, are you still upset about that? It was old junk, Nicole. We've been over this. You need to let it go and stop being so dramatic." I didn't respond to her directly. Instead, I gestured toward the dining room where I had set up a screen connected to my laptop. The presentation was ready, the first slide waiting. "Please sit down, everyone." Something in my voice made Emily's laughter die. She looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time I saw a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. This was not the sister she was used to dismissing. This was not the Nicole who apologized and accommodated and smoothed things over to keep the peace. "I'd rather stand," Emily said, crossing her arms defensively. "Sit down, Emily." Aunt Ruth's voice was quiet but firm. "This is important." The authority in Ruth's tone seemed to surprise everyone, including my father. Emily hesitated, then moved toward the dining room, dropping into a chair with the sullen energy of a teenager being forced to attend a family lecture. My father followed more slowly, his eyes never leaving my face, trying to read what was coming. The relatives took their seats around the table. I remained standing at the head near the screen, the laptop open before me. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant tick of a clock I had found at Martha's shop. "What is this about Nicole?" My father's voice was strained, the cheerful vacation persona completely gone now. "If you're upset about the furniture, we can discuss compensation. There's no need for all this." "This isn't about furniture," I said. "Not really. This is about truth. This is about 17 years of lies and secrets and choices that were made without my knowledge or consent. This is about who owns this house, who owns this family story, and who has been hiding things that were never theirs to hide." I saw Aunt Ruth's hands tighten in her lap. I saw my father's jaw clench. I saw Emily roll her eyes, still believing this was an overreaction she could dismiss with enough attitude. I turned on the presentation screen. The first image appeared a photograph of the empty living room, taken the morning I discovered what they had done. Dust outlines where furniture had stood, bare walls, evidence of betrayal, and everything they thought they knew was about to fall apart. The photograph of the empty living room hung on the screen like an accusation. I watched everyone's reactions in the silence that followed. Aunt Ruth's face tightened with something between anger and vindication. Margaret covered her mouth with her hand. Uncle David shifted uncomfortably, his eyes moving from the screen to my father and back again. "This is what I woke up to," I said, my voice steady. 2 weeks ago. The morning after I arrived home because Dad asked me to come discuss something important. I clicked to the next slide. The kitchen stripped bare, cabinets hanging open and empty, the yellow curtains my mother had sewn missing from above the sink. I walked through every room of this house finding the same thing: empty, gutted. Everything I owned, everything that connected me to my mother, to my grandparents, removed in the middle of the night while I slept upstairs. The next slide showed my bedroom. The dust outlines on the floor where furniture had stood for decades. The bare walls where photographs had hung. The closet door open to reveal nothing but wire hangers. "Nicole, this is family business." My father's voice cut through the silence, strained and tight. "I don't think we need to involve everyone in family business." I turned to face him directly. "You sold my belongings, Dad. You came into this house with a truck and removed everything I owned while I was sleeping. You left me a note." I clicked to the next slide where I had photographed the note he had written. His handwriting filled the screen large enough for everyone to read. "Nicole, we needed money for the trip. I sold your things. You don't really use them anyway. Emily deserves this vacation. She's been through so much. You understand, don't you? You always do." The words hung in the air like a confession. I heard Margaret draw a sharp breath. Uncle David muttered something under his breath that might have been a curse. "Emily deserves this vacation," I repeated, reading from the screen. "She's been through so much. You understand, don't you?" I let the silence stretch before continuing. "The family should know what kind of business this is. The kind where one daughter's belongings are sold to fund another daughter's luxury trip to Paris. The kind where understanding is assumed rather than asked for. The kind where I wake up in an empty house and I'm expected to accept it because I always do." Emily let out an exaggerated sigh, rolling her eyes with theatrical frustration. "Oh my God, here we go. It was just old furniture, Nicole. Ancient stuff that was falling apart anyway. We needed the money for the trip and you weren't using any of it. You don't even live here. Why are you being so dramatic about this?" I looked at Emily, seeing her clearly perhaps for the first time. The perfect makeup from the Paris trip was starting to show signs of jet lag. The designer clothes she had bought with money from my sold possessions hung on her frame like a costume. And her expression, that mix of annoyance and entitlement, showed not a flicker of remorse. But someone else was looking at Emily too. Aunt Ruth's gaze had fixed on my sister with an expression I had never seen her wear before. It was disappointment deep and profound, the kind that comes from watching someone reveal exactly who they are. "Emily," Ruth said quietly, "your sister's childhood bookshelf was sold, the one your grandfather built with his own hands. That wasn't old furniture, that was family history." Emily shrugged. "It was taking up space. We got good money for it." The casualness of her response seemed to hit Ruth like a physical blow. She sat back in her chair, shaking her head slowly. I clicked to the next set of slides. Receipts one after another filling the screen. "The old furniture you sold, I bought it back. Every piece I could track down. These are the receipts." The amount scrolled past. The bookshelf, the mirror, the quilts, the dining chairs. Item after item reclaimed at prices that often exceeded what Emily had sold them for, because that's how desperate I had been to recover what was mine. Some of the buyers were sympathetic when they learnt the truth. I continued. They felt they had been lied to. One woman in particular had something interesting to tell me. I pulled up a printed statement, a signed account from Patricia, the woman who had returned my grandfather's bookshelf without charge. Patricia Henderson purchased my grandfather's bookshelf. When she bought it, she was told that I was dead. "Emily, you told her that you were cleaning out your deceased sister's belongings. You told her I had passed away suddenly and the family was grieving." The room went completely silent. Emily's face changed, the defiance flickering into something else. Panic, maybe, or the realization that her lies were being documented and witnessed. She must have misunderstood." "She signed a statement," I said. "She's willing to testify if necessary. You told her your sister was dead, Emily. You told a stranger I had died so she wouldn't ask questions about why you were selling family heirlooms." My father was staring at Emily, now his face a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. "Emily, is that true? Did you tell people Nicole was dead?" I don't remember exactly what I said. I was just trying to sell the stuff, okay? People asked too many questions. I had to tell them something. "So you told them I was dead?" My voice remained calm, almost clinical. "You erased me. You told the world I didn't exist anymore because it was convenient for your sale." Aunt Ruth stood up abruptly, walking to the window and turning her back to the room. I could see her shoulders shaking slightly. Whether with anger or grief, I couldn't tell. Margaret spoke for the first time. "Emily, how could you say something like that about your own sister? It wasn't a big deal. It's not like Nicole was going to run into these people. I just needed them to stop asking questions and buy the furniture. You're all making this into something it isn't." I looked at my father, who had sunk lower in his chair, his vacation tan now looking sickly against his pale face. He wasn't defending Emily anymore. He wasn't defending himself. He was just sitting there watching his carefully constructed narrative crumble piece by piece. "But the furniture was never really the point," I said, reaching for the envelope that sat on the table beside my laptop. "The furniture was just what made me start looking. What I found goes much deeper than stolen belongings and convenient lies." I held up the envelope yellowed with age, my name written across the front, in my mother's handwriting. "The point is, in this envelope, this is what you never wanted me to find, Dad. This is the truth you buried for 17 years. I set the envelope down and picked up another document, this one crisp and official, bearing the seal of the county probate court. I held it up for everyone to see before placing it on the table where it could be examined. Before we get to the letter, there's something else the family needs to understand. This is a certified copy of my mother's last will and testament, filed 17 years ago after her death. My father's eyes fixed on the document like it was a venomous snake coiled on the table. I saw recognition flash across his face, the dawning realization that I knew things I was never supposed to discover. According to this legal document, I continued, I own 70% of this house. Emily owns 20%. My father has lifetime residency rights, meaning he can live here until he chooses to leave or passes away. But he owns nothing, 0%. The house belonged to my mother before she married him. It was her separate property inherited from her parents. She had complete authority to distribute it however she wanted. I looked directly at my father. Dad had no legal authority to sell anything from this house. Not my furniture, not my belongings, not the keepsake box my mother left me. Everything that was taken from me was taken illegally. What happened 2 weeks ago wasn't just a family disagreement. It was theft. Uncle David leaned forward to examine the will, his reading glasses perched on his nose. After a moment, he looked up at my father. Richard, is this accurate? Did you know about this? My father said nothing. His silence was answer enough. I've spent 15 years paying property taxes on this house, I said. 15 years contributing to repairs and maintenance. 15 years believing I was helping my father with his property, when in fact I was maintaining my own inheritance that he never told me existed. Emily was staring at the will with an expression I couldn't quite read. The entitlement had faded, replaced by something more like shock. Wait, I own part of the house too. 20%. You do. Mum wanted us both to have a stake in her family home. She trusted us to take care of it together. I paused. Although, I suspect if she had known you would sell her keepsake box, for $50 she might have reconsidered. I picked up the yellowed envelope again, holding it carefully, feeling the weight of my mother's final words in my hands. But the will is only part of what was hidden from me. This envelope was inside Mom's keepsake box in a secret compartment I never knew existed. Inside is a letter my mother wrote to me before she died. Aunt Ruth had turned back from the window, her eyes glistening. She knew what was coming. I had told her about the letters when I called, but hearing it confirmed in front of the family was different. Mom wrote to me about the house, about her hopes for our family, about her worries for Emily. I looked at my sister. She wrote that she was leaving me the largest share because she trusted me to use it wisely. She wrote that Dad meant well, but didn't always see things clearly. She asked me to watch over you, Emily, to be patient with you, but also honest. Emily's face was pale now, the jet lag and the revelations combining to drain the colour from her cheeks. But here's what matters most. I turned the envelope so everyone could see it. When I found this letter, the envelope had already been opened. Someone had read my mother's final words to me before I ever had the chance. Someone had taken this letter from the box, opened it, read it, and then hidden it where I would never find it. I looked at my father. There were supposed to be other letters too. Mum told me in my letter that she had written to Emily, to you, and to Aunt Ruth. She asked me to make sure everyone received them. But I never got my letter, so I couldn't deliver anyone else's. I set the envelope down. Where are they, Dad? Where are the letters Mum wrote to Emily and Aunt Ruth? The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one breathed. Every eye in the room was fixed on my father, who sat motionless in his chair like a man facing a firing squad. Richard. Aunt Ruth's voice was barely above a whisper. Susan told me she was writing letters. I asked you about them after she died. You said there weren't any. You said she was confused from the medication. My father's face crumbled. The facade he had maintained for 17 years, the story he had told himself, and everyone else collapsed in the space between one heartbeat and the next. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. You knew Mom wrote to us? Emily's voice was small, almost childlike, stripped of its usual bravado. You knew she wrote letters, and you never told me. You never gave me mine. Still, my father said nothing. She wrote to you, to Dad. My voice was steady, but I could feel the emotion pressing against my control. She wrote asking you to treat us fairly, to see me for who I am instead of overlooking me, to stop spoiling Emily and teach her to stand on her own feet. She saw what was happening in this family even then. She tried to guide you from beyond her death, and you read her words and buried them. I was trying to protect her. The words came out of my father in a broken whisper, so quiet I almost didn't hear them. Emily was so young. Susan's letter to her said hard things about learning to be independent, about not depending on others. I thought it would devastate her. I thought I was protecting her. By lying to her for 17 years, Aunt Ruth's voice shook with barely contained fury. By lying to all of us, Susan wanted her daughters to have her wisdom Richard. She wanted us to help guide this family. You stole that from her. You stole her voice. Emily stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Her face was a battlefield of emotions, disbelief and betrayal, and something that might have been the first stirrings of genuine self-reflection. You hid Mum's letter from me, she said, staring at our father. You hid it, and then you spent 17 years telling me I was special, that I deserved everything, that Nicole didn't matter as much as I did. Was that all a lie? Was everything a lie? Dad couldn't speak. His mouth moved, but nothing came out. Tears were streaming down his face now. The tears of a man watching everything he had built on deception finally fall apart. So, I spoke for him. Mum's letter to Emily is in a room I've prepared, along with some other things she needs to see. I looked at my sister. Come with me. There's more you need to understand, and it's not something for everyone to witness. I walked toward the hallway, and after a moment's hesitation, Emily followed. Behind us, the living room remained frozen. Aunt Ruth crying silently, Uncle David shaking his head, my father broken in his chair. And then I took Emily to see her room. The hallway felt longer than usual as I led Emily toward the guest room. Her footsteps behind me were hesitant, uncertain, the confident stride she normally carried completely absent. I could hear her breathing shallow and quick, the breathing of someone who senses they are walking towards something that will change them. I stopped at the closed door and turned to face her. Before we go in, I want you to understand something. I didn't create this room to hurt you. I created it because I think you deserve the truth, even if the truth is painful. Mum asked me to be honest with you. This is me being honest. Emily said nothing. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her mascara already starting to smudge from the tears that had begun in the living room. She looked younger somehow, stripped of her armour of entitlement and designer confidence. I opened the door. The room was beautiful, just as I had designed it. Soft sage green walls, comfortable furniture, warm lighting that made the space feel safe rather than harsh. Emily stepped inside slowly, her eyes moving across the details, taking in the bed, with its white linens, the armchair in the corner, the curtains that filtered the evening light. Then her gaze landed on the desk. Folders were arranged in neat rows, labelled and organised. Emily walked toward them, as if drawn by something she couldn't resist, her hand reaching out to touch the first folder, before she even consciously decided to look. She opened it and went still. Credit card statements. Page after page of them organised by account, showing the progression of her debt over the past several years. The balances started modest and grew steadily minimum payments that barely touched the interest late fees, accumulating like snow in a blizzard. The next folder held collection notices, some of them threatening legal action, others offering settlement options for debts that had spiralled beyond her ability to repay. How did you get these? Her voice was barely audible. My lawyer pulled them during a financial background check. It's all public record once accounts go to collections, Emily. Anyone can find this information if they know where to look. She flipped through the pages, her hands trembling as the full picture came into focus. $30,000. Maybe more when you added the interest and penalties that were still accumulating. A mountain of debt she had been running from hiding, from pretending didn't exist while she posted photos of Paris shopping sprees. "I was going to figure it out," she whispered. "I had a plan, I just needed more time." "What plan? More credit cards, more loans, more trips to Paris funded by selling other people's belongings." Emily closed the folder and set it down like it burned her fingers. Her eyes moved to the bed, to the pillow, to the envelope that sat there waiting. "That's from Mum," I said. "She wrote it for you 17 years ago. Dad hid it in the same place he hid mine. The seal has never been broken. You'll be the first person to read it." Emily approached the bed, slowly reaching for the envelope like it might disappear if she moved too quickly. Her name was written across the front in our mother's handwriting, the same careful letters I had seen on my own envelope. She picked it up and held it for a long moment, just staring at it, at this piece of our mother that had been kept from her for nearly 2 decades. Then she broke the seal. I watched her eyes move across the pages, watched her expression shift as our mother's words sank in. I didn't know exactly what Mum had written to Emily, but I could guess from the fragments I had seen from the references in my own letter. Words of love, certainly, but also words of warning, concerns about Emily's dependence on others, hopes that she would learn to stand on her own feet, instructions to learn from her sister's strength. Emily read the letter twice. By the time she finished the second reading, tears were streaming down her face, falling onto the paper, smudging the ink our mother had written so carefully all those years ago. "She knew," Emily said, her voice cracking. "She knew I was going to turn out like this. She tried to warn me, and I never even got the chance to hear her." I walked to the desk where my laptop sat and opened it. "There's one more thing I need you to see." The video began to play. A backyard familiar and sun-dappled are the scene of Emily's 12th birthday party just months after our mother died. The camera was shaky, operated by someone who didn't quite know how to hold it steady. Then, Emily's face filled the frame, young and earnest, her eyes bright with the innocent certainty of childhood. "I want to say something," the 12-year-old Emily announced. "Nicole is the best sister in the whole world. She made my cake and she wrapped all my presents and she always takes care of me. When I grow up, I want to be just like her." The video ended. The room fell silent except for the sound of Emily's breathing, ragged and broken. I looked at my sister, at the woman she had become, standing in a room, surrounded by evidence of her failures, holding a letter from a mother who had seen this future and tried to prevent it. The contrast between who she was and who she had wanted to be hung in the air like something physical. Emily's legs gave out. She didn't faint. She didn't collapse dramatically. She simply slid down the wall behind her, her back scraping against the sage green paint until she was sitting on the floor with her knees drawn up to her chest. The crying that followed was not the pretty tears of movies, not the gentle weeping that could be fixed with a tissue. It was ugly and raw, the heaving sobs of someone whose entire self-image was crumbling in real time. "I didn't know," she choked out between sobs. "I didn't know Mum wrote to me. I didn't know I owed so much. I didn't know what I was doing to you, not really. I didn't know I'd become—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The words dissolved into more crying, more gasping, more of the grief that comes when you finally see yourself clearly. I stood by the door, watching her fall apart. Part of me wanted to go to her, to kneel down and hold her the way I had when we were children, and she would skin her knee or have a nightmare. But this wasn't a skinned knee. This was 17 years of accumulated damage, and she needed to feel the full weight of it before she could begin to heal. "I'm going to give you some time," I said quietly. "Read Mum's letter again. Look at everything in this room. Really look at it. When you're ready, come back to the living room." I stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind me, leaving Emily alone with the truth she had spent her entire adult life avoiding. But Emily wasn't the only one who needed to face the truth that night. When I returned to the living room, my father was still sitting in the same chair, but something fundamental had changed. The defensive posture was gone. The excuses that had always come so easily had dried up. He looked like a man who had been carrying a weight for 17 years and had finally set it down, not because he chose to, but because he no longer had the strength to hold it. Aunt Ruth had moved to sit beside Margaret on the couch. Uncle David remained standing by the fireplace, his arms crossed, his expression a mixture of anger and sorrow. They all looked up when I entered, but no one spoke. They were waiting for something, though I wasn't sure any of us knew exactly what. I took a seat across from my father, close enough to see the lines on his face, the grey in his hair, the tears that had left tracks through the tan he had gotten in Paris. He looked older than he had 2 weeks ago. He looked like a man facing the consequences of choices he had made before I was old enough to understand them. "Where's Emily?" Aunt Ruth asked quietly. "She needs some time alone. She's reading Mum's letter." My father flinched at the mention of the letter, as if the words themselves caused physical pain. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock and the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Then, my father began to speak. "When Susan died," he said, his voice rough and broken, "I found the letters in her nightstand. She had left them there organised in envelopes, each one labelled with a name. I knew she had been writing something in those final weeks, but I thought it was a journal, something private. I didn't expect them to be for us." He paused, his hands gripping the arms of the chair. "I read them all, every single one. I told myself I was just making sure they were appropriate, that she hadn't written anything in confusion or pain that might hurt someone. But really, I was looking for something. Validation, maybe. Proof that she saw me the way I wanted to be seen." His eyes met mine briefly, then dropped to the floor. What I found was the opposite. Susan loved me. That was clear in every line she wrote, but she also saw me clearly. She saw that I favoured Emily, that I overlooked Nicole, that I had been doing it for years, even before she got sick. She saw my flaws laid out plainly, and she tried to correct them with her final words. Aunt Ruth made a small sound, something between grief and vindication. My father continued as if he hadn't heard her. "The letter to Nicole talked about trust. Susan trusted you more than anyone, Nicole. She trusted you to take care of the house, to watch over your sister, to be the strong one. And she trusted you because she knew you already were those things without being asked." He swallowed hard. The letter to Emily was different. It was full of love, but also worry. Susan could see where Emily was headed. She warned her about depending too much on others, about expecting things to be given rather than earned. She asked Emily to learn from her sister. "And you decided Emily couldn't handle that," I said. It wasn't a question. "I convinced myself I was protecting her." My father's voice cracked. "Emily was only 11 years old. She had just lost her mother. How could I give her a letter that said her mother worried about who she might become? I thought it would devastate her. I thought I was being kind." He stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back, unable to stay still. "So I hid the letters, all of them. I told myself I would give them out later when Emily was older, when she could handle the truth. But later never came. The longer I waited, the harder it became. The lies built on themselves. And somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking about the letters at all. I buried them so deep that I almost forgot they existed." "You didn't forget," I said quietly. "You just chose not to remember." He nodded, accepting the accusation. "I convinced myself I was protecting Emily by giving her extra love, extra attention, extra everything. I thought I could make up for what the letters said by proving Susan wrong. I would raise Emily to be so happy, so confident, that the worries in that letter would never come true." He turned to face me directly. "But I wasn't protecting Emily. I was protecting myself from having to face that my wife saw my flaws. from having to admit that she was right about how I treated my daughters. Every time I spoiled Emily, every time I overlooked you, I was running from Susan's words. The room was so quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat. And Nicole. My father's voice broke completely on my name. Every time I looked at you, I saw your mother's face. The same eyes, the same expressions, the same quiet strength. And I saw the trust she placed in you, trust she didn't place in me. I pushed you away because I was ashamed, not of you, never of you, of myself, of who I was compared to who Susan needed me to be. He sat back down heavily, like his legs could no longer support him. I told myself you were fine. You were strong, independent, successful. You didn't need me the way Emily did. But that was another lie. You needed me just as much. You needed a father who saw you, who valued you, who didn't make you feel invisible in your own family. And I failed you. Every single day for 17 years I failed you. Tears were streaming down his face now, unchecked and unashamed. I'm sorry doesn't cover it. I know that. 3 words can't undo 17 years of damage. I destroyed all 3 of us trying to protect one. I turned Emily into exactly the person Susan worried she would become. I turned you into a stranger in your own home. And I turned myself into a liar who couldn't face his own wife's final wishes. He looked at me with eyes that held nothing back. No defences, no excuses, just raw and terrible honesty. I have no excuse. I only have the truth finally. The truth I should have given everyone 17 years ago. The living room was silent for a long moment. The confession hung in the air, heavy and irreversible, changing everything it touched. I looked at my father and saw not the villain I'd been building in my mind, but something more complicated. A weak man who had made terrible choices out of fear and shame. A father who had loved his daughters but failed them both in different ways. A widower who had never processed his grief and had let it poison everything he touched. It wasn't forgiveness I felt. Not yet, maybe not ever, but it was understanding. Then, Aunt Ruth stood up. Aunt Ruth crossed the room slowly, her footsteps deliberate, her posture carrying the weight of years of unspoken observations. She stopped in front of my father, looking down at him, with an expression that mixed love with profound disappointment. Then she turned to face the room, positioning herself so everyone could see her clearly. I've watched this family for 17 years, she began, her voice steady but heavy with emotion. Every holiday, every birthday, every family gathering, I watched and I stayed silent, and I have to live with that. But I won't stay silent anymore. She took a breath, steadying herself. I watched you overlook Nicole's birthday every single year, Richard. Every year. Do you even remember the last time you called her on her birthday? Because I do. It was never. I watched Emily get parties, cakes, presents piled on the table. And I watched Nicole sit in the corner smiling, pretending she didn't notice that no one had remembered her. My father's head dropped into his hands, but Aunt Ruth wasn't finished. I watched Nicole call you every week. Every week, Richard. She'd ask about your health, ask if you needed anything, ask about the house. And I watched you cut those calls short, tell her you were busy, say you'd call her back and never do. She called anyway, the next week and the week after that and the week after that. For 17 years, she kept trying to connect with a father who couldn't be bothered to pick up the phone. I felt something loosen in my chest, something I hadn't realised had been wound so tight. Hearing it spoken aloud, confirmed by someone outside my own head, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. The pattern wasn't my imagination. The invisibility wasn't something I had created. Other people had seen it. They had just chosen not to speak. Nicole called me every holiday, Ruth continued. Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, my birthday. She sent gifts for my grandchildren. She remembered their names, their ages, what they were interested in. She sent cards with handwritten notes, not just signatures. She made me feel like family, even when her own family was treating her like a stranger. Ruth turned to look at Emily's empty chair, then back to my father. Emily, I haven't heard from Emily in 3 years. Not unless she needed something. The last time she called me was to ask if I could lend her money for a yoga retreat. She didn't ask how I was doing. She didn't remember my grandchildren's names. She just wanted a check. Margaret shifted on the couch, nodding slowly. Uncle David's jaw was tight, his arms still crossed. But, Richard, when I talked to you, all you ever mentioned was Emily. Emily, this, Emily, that. Emily's new apartment, Emily's new boyfriend, Emily's new hobby. It was like Nicole didn't exist. I would ask about her specifically, and you would give one-word answers and change the subject back to Emily. After a while, I stopped asking. It felt like prying into something you didn't want to discuss. She moved closer to my father, close enough that he had to look up at her. Susan would be devastated if she saw this family today. You know that, don't you? She loved both her daughters. She loved them equally and differently, the way all mothers do. She wrote those letters because she wanted balance, Richard. She saw the pattern starting, and she tried to correct them. She trusted you to listen to her wisdom, to honour her wishes, to raise your daughters the way she would have wanted. Ruth's voice cracked, but she pushed through. Instead, you buried her words. You silenced her voice. You took the last gift she tried to give her children, and you locked it away in the dark. Susan didn't write those letters from confusion or medication. She wrote them from love. And you treated that love like it was something to be ashamed of. My father was weeping openly now, making no attempt to hide or control it. The tears fell onto his shirt, leaving dark spots on the fabric he had probably bought in Paris with money from my sold belongings. Margaret spoke up from the couch, her voice quieter than Ruth's, but no less impactful. I noticed it too. At Susan's funeral, Nicole was the one handling everything. She organised the service, managed the reception, made sure everyone was taken care of. She was 19 years old, and she was running the entire event while grieving her mother. And Richard, you barely looked at her. You spent the whole day with Emily on your lap, accepting condolences, while Nicole worked in the background like hired help. Uncle David finally uncrossed his arms. The Christmas after Susan died, I brought presents for both girls. Equivalent gifts, exactly the same value, because that's what Susan would have wanted. Richard, you made a big show of Emily opening hers. You took pictures, you clapped, you talked about how much Emily deserved something nice after such a hard year. When Nicole opened hers, you were in the kitchen getting more coffee. You didn't even see her face when she unwrapped it. The memories were piling up now, each one a small piece of evidence in a case I had spent my whole life unable to prove. The pattern wasn't invisible. It had been witnessed by everyone in this room. They had all seen the favoritism, the overlooking, the systematic erasure of one daughter to elevate the other. And they had all, for their own reasons, chosen to say nothing. We all failed you, Nicole. Margaret's voice was thick with tears. We saw what was happening, and we told ourselves it wasn't our business. We told ourselves your father was grieving, that he was doing his best, that things would get better with time. We made excuses for him, because making excuses was easier than confronting the truth. Susan was my best friend, Ruth said, her composure finally breaking. She asked me right before she died to watch over her family, to make sure Richard didn't lose himself in grief, to make sure the girls grew up knowing they were both loved. And I failed her. I let this happen. I let her family fall apart, and I told myself there was nothing I could do. The room fell silent again, the weight of shared guilt pressing down on everyone. My father sat, broken in his chair. The relatives stood or sat in various postures of regret, and I remained where I was, absorbing the validation I had never known I needed. It wasn't my imagination. It wasn't oversensitivity or victim mentality or any of the things I had sometimes accused myself of being. The pattern was real. The harm was real. And now, Finally, it had been spoken aloud by people who had witnessed it from the outside. I was about to speak to try to find words for the complicated mixture of grief and relief churning inside me when movement in the doorway caught my attention. Emily stood there. Her face was swollen from crying, her makeup completely destroyed, mascara trails running down her cheeks like dark rivers. She was clutching our mother's letter in one hand, the paper crumpled from being gripped too tightly. Her eyes were red and raw, but something in them had changed. The defensive entitlement was gone, replaced by something I couldn't quite identify. She walked into the room slowly, her gaze moving from face to face, taking in the tears, the grief, the 17 years of damage laid bare in the evening light. Then Emily did something no one expected. Emily walked toward me, not with her usual confident stride, but with the uncertain steps of someone who had just had their entire foundation shaken. She stopped a few feet away, close enough that I could see the trembling in her hands, the way she clutched our mother's letter like it was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become unstable. For a long moment, she just stood there looking at me, really looking, maybe for the first time in years. Not through me, not past me, not with the dismissive glance she usually gave before turning her attention to something more interesting. She looked at me like she was seeing a person she had forgotten existed. Then she spoke. "I can't blame Dad for everything." The words came out rough, scraped raw by the crying she had done in the other room. The family members shifted in their seats, surprised. This wasn't the Emily they knew. This wasn't deflection or excuse-making or dramatic victimhood. This was something else entirely. "I knew what I was doing hurt you," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe not always in the moment. Maybe I didn't think about it that clearly. But somewhere inside me I knew. I saw your face at holidays when Dad ignored you. I saw you paying bills and fixing things and showing up for every occasion, and I saw that no one thanked you. I saw all of it." She swallowed hard, forcing herself to keep going. "And I chose not to care, because it benefited me. Because as long as you were the one being overlooked, I was the one being celebrated. As long as you were invisible, I got to be the star." The honesty of it hit me like something physical. I had expected defensiveness, justifications, tears designed to make herself the victim of circumstances beyond her control. I had not expected this. "I liked being the favourite." Emily's voice cracked on the admission. "I liked that Dad always took my side. I liked that I could do no wrong while you could do no right. It made me feel special. It made me feel loved. And I told myself that was okay because you were strong. You didn't need what I needed. You were fine on your own." She laughed bitterly, the sound catching in her throat. "That's what I told myself every time I saw you hurting. Nicole's strong. Nicole can handle it. Nicole doesn't feel things the way I do. I used your strength as an excuse for my weakness. I let you carry everything so I wouldn't have to carry anything." Aunt Ruth was crying again silently, her hand pressed to her mouth. Margaret had her arm around her. Uncle David had turned away, unable to watch, and my father sat frozen, seeing his younger daughter clearly, perhaps for the first time seeing the person his favouritism had created. Emily took another step toward me, closing the distance between us. "Mum's letter said she was worried about me. She said I depended too much on other people, that I expected love to be given instead of earned. She said I needed to learn from you, from your strength, from the way you gave without expecting anything back." She held up the crumpled pages, the letter that had been hidden from her for 17 years. "She saw what I would become. She saw it when I was 11 years old, and she tried to warn me. And Dad kept that from me. He kept me from having any chance to hear her, to learn from her, to change, before I became exactly what she feared." Her face contorted with fresh grief, but she pushed through it. "But I can't use that as an excuse either. Even without the letter, I had chances. Hundreds of chances. To be different, to be better, to see what I was doing to you. And every single time, I chose myself. I chose comfort over growth. I chose being spoiled over being good. Emily's legs seemed to weaken and she steadied herself against the back of a chair. In that room, I saw the video from my birthday. I heard myself saying I wanted to be just like you when I grew up. Her voice broke completely. I was 12 years old and I admired you more than anyone in the world. And look at me now. Look at what I became instead. The silence in the room was absolute. No one moved. No one breathed. We all just waited, caught in the gravity of a moment none of us had anticipated. Emily straightened herself with visible effort, forcing herself to stand without support. She faced me directly, her swollen eyes meeting mine without flinching. I'm not asking you to forgive me right now. I know I don't deserve that. You might never forgive me, and that would be fair. That would be more than fair. I'm not asking for anything. She took a shaky breath. I just need you to know that I see it now. I see what I did. I see who I became. I see the person I turned into while I was busy telling myself I was the victim, the special one, the one who deserved everything. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. And I'm ashamed. I'm so deeply ashamed that I don't know how to live with it. She stood there, exposed and broken, waiting for my response. The room waited too, everyone holding their breath, wondering what I would do with this unexpected offering. I thought about the empty house, the note on the counter, the keepsake box sold for $50, the 17 years of birthdays forgotten, calls unanswered, presents ignored. I thought about the woman standing before me, the sister, who had told strangers I was dead, who had laughed about selling my belongings, who had called me selfish for refusing to fund her designer handbag. And I thought about my mother's letter. Watch over Emily. Be patient with her, but also be honest with her. I didn't hug Emily. I didn't tell her it was okay, because it wasn't. 17 years of damage couldn't be erased by one tearful speech, no matter how genuine it seemed. The wound was too deep, the pattern too ingrained, the trust too thoroughly destroyed for words alone to heal. But I also didn't turn away. That's the first honest thing you've said to me in 17 years. I said, my voice calm and measured. It's a start. Emily's face crumpled with something that might have been relief or might have been fresh grief for all the years that honesty had been absent. She nodded, accepting my response for what it was. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, just acknowledgement that something real had finally happened between us. I know it's just a start, she said quietly. I know I have to do more than say words. I have to be different. Actually, different. Not just, different. I looked at my sister, at the ruins of the person she had been, at the faint possibility of someone new trying to emerge from the wreckage. I wanted to believe her. Part of me desperately wanted to believe that this moment was real, that change was possible, that my mother's hope for Emily could still come true after all these years. But I had been disappointed too many times. I had believed too many promises that turned out to be empty. Apologies are just words, I said. What matters is what you do next. What you do tomorrow, and the day after, and every day after that. Emily nodded again, accepting the condition. I understand. But apologies are just words. I needed to see if she understood what comes next. The family meeting had broken up sometime after midnight, everyone exhausted from the emotional weight of the evening. Aunt Ruth had hugged me before leaving, whispering that she was proud of me and sorry it had taken so long for anyone to say it. Margaret and Uncle David had offered similar sentiments, quieter and more awkward but genuine in their own way. My father had retreated to his bedroom without another word, and Emily had gone back to the truth room, saying she needed more time with our mother's letter. I slept on the couch in the living room, not wanting to displace anyone, but also not ready to leave the house unattended. My sleep was shallow and interrupted, full of fragments of the day replaying themselves in no particular order. When morning light finally crept through the windows, I felt like I hadn't rested at all, but I had work to do. I made coffee in the newly organised kitchen, the smell filling the house like a signal that a new day had begun. By the time my father emerged from his room looking like he had aged 10 years overnight, I had set up the dining room table with folders and documents. Emily appeared shortly after, still wearing the clothes from the night before, her face puffy and pale. "Sit down," I said. "Both of you. We need to talk about what happens next." They sat without argument, too depleted to resist. I remained standing, positioning myself at the head of the table, the way I had during the presentation the night before. This was not a conversation between equals. This was a negotiation, and I intended to make my terms clear. I opened the first folder and slid it across the table to Emily. "This is a summary of your debt. $30,247 across 5 credit cards. 3 of those accounts are in collections. 2 more will be within the next 60 days if no payments are made." Emily looked at the papers like they might bite her. "I know I owe money. I was going to figure it out. While you were in Paris, while you were buying Chanel bags with money that doesn't exist." I kept my voice level, factual, refusing to let anger seep in. "This isn't going to figure itself out, Emily. This is a crisis that's been building for years and it's about to explode." I slid another document toward my father. "Dad, you co-signed as guarantor on the largest account, $18,000. If Emily defaults and she's already in default, they come after you. At your age, with your income, that could destroy you. Your credit, your savings, possibly even this house if they pursue a judgment." My father stared at the document, his face going pale. "I didn't know it was that much. She said it was just a small card for emergencies." "She lied. I said it plainly without accusation, just fact. And you didn't ask questions because you never ask questions when it comes to Emily. You just sign whatever she puts in front of you and trust that everything will work out." Emily flinched at my words, but she didn't deny them. "Here's what's going to happen," I continued. "Emily, you created this problem. You will solve it. I am not paying your debt. I am not bailing you out. I am not writing a check to make this disappear so you can learn nothing and do it all again in 5 years. I pulled out a third document, this one several pages long. "But I have created a realistic repayment plan. If you get a job, a real job with a regular paycheck, and if you live within your means, you can pay this off in approximately 3 years. The interest rates are brutal, but I've calculated minimum payments that will keep the collectors at bay while you chip away at the principal." Emily took the plan with trembling hands, scanning the numbers. "This says I need to make almost $1,000 a month in payments." "Yes, which means you need income. Regular, reliable income from a job you show up to every day. Not a scheme, not a side hustle, not waiting for Dad to fix it. A job." I pointed to a section near the bottom of the page. "I've also listed items you can sell to make an immediate dent in the balance. The designer bags from Paris, the jewellery you've accumulated, the clothes you bought with credit cards you couldn't afford. Every dollar you raise from selling those things is $1 less in interest eating you alive." Emily's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. Some part of her, the part that had broken down in the truth room, seemed to understand that this was not negotiable. I turned to my father. "Dad, you're not off the hook either. You enabled this. You co-signed loans you didn't understand. You gave money you couldn't afford. You created a person who never learned consequences. That stops now. No more checks to cover Emily's emergencies. No more signing documents without reading them. No more pretending everything is fine while the house burns down around you." My father nodded slowly, not meeting my eyes. "Now, about the house." I stood straighter, feeling the weight of what I was about to say. "This house is 70% mine legally. Mum left it to me because she trusted me to take care of it. I intend to honour that trust." Both of them looked up, fear flickering across their faces. They were wondering if I was about to kick them out to sell the property to punish them by taking away the roof over their heads. I'm not going to sell it, I said. And I'm not going to kick anyone out. You can both continue living here. But I will no longer be treated as a guest in my own property. I will be making decisions about this house. Real decisions, maintenance improvements, how the space is used. If I want to visit, I visit. If I want to make changes, I make them. This is my home too, and it's time everyone started treating it that way. Emily and my father exchanged a glance, relief, mixed with something else. Maybe the beginning of understanding that the old dynamic was truly over. Finally, I said, we need to talk about the future. Not promises, not intentions, actual measurable actions. I sat down across from them, looking at each of their faces in turn. In 1 year, we'll see where we all stand. I'll be watching to see if Emily has kept a job, made her payments, started becoming the person Mum wanted her to be. I'll be watching to see if Dad has stopped favouring, started treating both his daughters with equal respect. I paused, letting the word settle. If you've genuinely changed, if I see real evidence of growth and accountability, then we can start rebuilding something real. A family that functions. A relationship based on mutual respect instead of obligation and resentment. My voice hardened slightly. But if a year from now nothing has changed, if Emily is still running from her debts and Dad is still making excuses, then I'll make different decisions. About the house, about the family, about how much of my life I'm willing to spend on people who refuse to grow. The room was silent. Emily was crying again quietly, the tears sliding down her cheeks. My father sat motionless, absorbing the terms of his own accountability. Do you understand? I asked. They both nodded. Good. I stood up, gathering the folders. I've left copies of everything in the study. The repayment plan, the house documents, all of it. Review it. Ask questions if you have them. But understand that this is not a negotiation. This is how things will be. I walked toward the hallway, then stopped and turned back. I'll be checking in regularly, not to hover but to see progress. Actions, not words. That's all I'm asking for. That's all Mum ever asked for. That night I packed my bags. I wasn't staying in that house any longer, but not for the reasons they might think. I had moved back to my apartment in the city the morning after setting my terms. Not because I was running away, but because I needed distance to see clearly. When you're standing inside a situation, it's hard to tell if things are really changing, or if you're just hoping so hard that you're seeing what you want to see. I needed to step back far enough to observe without the distortion of daily proximity. The first few weeks were quiet. I heard from Sarah that Emily had started looking for jobs, that she had made appointments with a debt counsellor, that she was following the plan I had laid out. But I took those reports with caution. Starting is easy. Anyone can start. The question was whether Emily could sustain. The answer came slowly in small pieces over the weeks that followed. Emily got a job, not a glamorous one, not something she could brag about on social media, but a real job with a regular paycheck. Administrative assistant at a small insurance agency, answering phones, filing paperwork, scheduling appointments. The kind of work she had always considered beneath her. The kind of work that builds character, precisely because it doesn't offer shortcuts to status. She showed up every day. That was what surprised me most. The Emily I knew would have found excuses within a week, would have complained about the early hours, or the boring tasks, or the unfairness of having to work when other people had things handed to them. But according to the reports filtering back through family channels, Emily arrived on time, did what was asked, and didn't quit. The designer bags went on consignment. All of them. The Chanel from Paris. The Louis Vuitton she had accumulated over years of treating credit cards like free money. The Prada and Gucci and all the other logos she had wrapped around herself like armour against the reality of who she was. She sold them and put every dollar toward her debt. $8,500 in total, a significant dent in the mountain she had built. It wasn't enough to fix everything. She still owed over $20,000. But it was a start, A real start backed by action instead of promises. The phone calls began about 3 weeks after I left. The first one was awkward, stilted, filled with long pauses and careful words. Emily called on a Sunday afternoon, and when I saw her name on my screen, my first instinct was to let it go to voicemail. I was so conditioned to expect demands, requests for money, complaints about how unfair everything was. But I answered. "Nicole, it's Emily. I wanted to call, to talk, if that's okay." We spoke for maybe 10 minutes that first time, neither of us sure what to say. She told me about her job. I told her about a project I was working on. The conversation was surface level, circling around the deeper issues without touching them. But she didn't ask for anything. She didn't complain about her circumstances. She just talked like a person trying to remember how to connect with another person. The next Sunday, she called again, and the Sunday after that. The calls became a ritual, a weekly check-in that neither of us formally agreed to, but both of us showed up for. Slowly, gradually, the awkwardness began to fade. The silences became less uncomfortable. The topics expanded beyond safe small talk into something approaching real conversation. She asked about my work, not in the dismissive way she used to, the way that made it clear she wasn't really listening and didn't really care. She asked follow-up questions. She remembered details from the previous week and brought them up again. She seemed genuinely interested in understanding what I did, why I found it meaningful, what challenges I was facing. It felt strange. After 17 years of being invisible to my sister, having her attention focused on me was disorienting. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the old Emily to resurface with a request or a complaint or a manipulation disguised as affection. But week after week, it didn't happen. One Sunday, about 3 months after the confrontation, Emily said something that stopped me mid-breath. "I read Mum's letter again last night," she said, her voice quiet and reflective. "I've read it probably 50 times now. Each time I noticed something different." I waited, not sure where she was going. She said I needed to learn from your strength. I used to think I knew what that meant. I thought it meant you were tough, that you didn't feel things, that emotions bounced off you like you were made of stone. I almost laughed. If only she knew how many nights I had cried alone in my apartment, how many times I had felt the weight of being unseen crushing down on me. "But I understand now," Emily continued. "You're not strong because nothing hurts you. You're strong because you keep going even when it does. You felt everything. I felt maybe more. You just didn't let it stop you. You kept showing up, kept trying, kept giving, even when no one gave back." The words landed somewhere deep in my chest, in a place I hadn't realised was waiting to receive them. "That's what Mum wanted me to learn," Emily said. "Not how to be hard, how to be resilient, how to keep moving forward even when it would be easier to give up. I'm trying, Nicole. I know I have so far to go, but I'm trying." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to pour out years of accumulated hurt, to tell her how long I had waited for someone in my family to see me, to understand me, to acknowledge that my strength came at a cost. But another part of me recognised that this moment was fragile, that Emily was offering something genuine, and that responding with old grievances might shatter the progress she was making. "Thank you for telling me that," I said finally. "It means more than you know." The call ended shortly after, both of us retreating to process what had been shared. I sat in my apartment watching the evening light fade through my windows, thinking about what transformation really looks like. It's not dramatic. It's not a single moment of revelation that changes everything forever. It's small steps repeated daily, building slowly towards something new. Emily was taking those steps. I could hear it in her voice, see it in her actions. Less entitlement, more awareness, maybe even a little humility. Did I trust it completely? No. 3 months wasn't 17 years. The patterns that had formed over a lifetime wouldn't dissolve in a single season. Emily might backslide. She might hit a hard moment and reach for her old coping mechanisms of denial and entitlement. She might wake up one day and decide that growth was too hard and comfort was more appealing. But she might not. She might keep going. She might become the person our mother had hoped. She would be the person that little girl at her 12th birthday party had wanted to grow into. I found myself hoping, carefully, cautiously, protecting myself from disappointment while still allowing the possibility of something better to exist. Then came my birthday, the first time in 17 years it wasn't forgotten. My birthday fell on a Tuesday that year. I had made no special plans, expecting to spend it the way I had spent most of my birthdays for the past 17 years, quietly alone, treating it as just another day, because no one else seemed to notice it was anything more. I had scheduled a normal workday planned to order takeout for dinner, maybe watch a movie before bed, nothing extravagant, nothing that would highlight the absence of celebration. Emily had called the Sunday before, which was unexpected enough on its own. She had wished me an early happy birthday, told me she had mailed a card, asked what my plans were. When I told her I didn't have any, she had gone quiet for a moment before saying, "You deserve plans, Nicole. You deserve someone making a fuss over you." The comment had stayed with me, lodging somewhere in my chest like a small warm ember. The Tuesday itself started normally. I went to work, sat through meetings, handled the usual stream of emails and decisions that filled my days. By late afternoon, I was ready to head home to my quiet apartment and my solo dinner. But when I opened my door, I found something I never expected. My father was standing in the hallway. He looked older than he had 4 months ago, the lines on his face deeper, his posture slightly stooped. But there was something different about his eyes. The defensive guardedness that had always been there, the wall he put up to keep difficult emotions at bay, seemed thinner somehow, more permeable. In his hands, he held my mother's keepsake box. "Happy birthday, Nicole," he said, his voice rough and uncertain. "May I come in?" I stepped aside wordlessly, my mind racing to make sense of what was happening. My father had never visited my apartment before. In all the years I had lived in the city, he had never made the trip. I had invited him countless times, and there had always been an excuse. A reason he couldn't make it a prior commitment that conveniently prevented him from entering my world. He walked into my small living room, looking around at the space I had created for myself. The photographs on the walls, the books on the shelves, the modest but comfortable furniture I had chosen with care. He took it all in like he was seeing me for the first time, which, in a way, he was. "Martha told me you found the box at her shop," he said, still holding it carefully. "After everything that happened, I went to see her. I wanted to thank her for keeping it safe, for making sure it found its way back to you." He held out the box, and I took it, feeling its familiar weight in my hands. "She's a remarkable woman," he continued. "She told me about her daughter, about why she keeps things with memories attached. We talked for a long time." I set the box on my coffee table, not sure what to say. While I was there, I asked if I could buy something from her, something to add to the box to make it more complete. He gestured toward it. "Open it." I lifted the lid, seeing the familiar contents, the photographs, the dried flowers, the small mementos I had already examined and treasured. But nestled among them was something new. A handwritten letter, folded neatly, my name written on the outside in my father's cramped handwriting. "I've spent 4 months trying to write that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've gone through 17 drafts. I'd write something and then realise it wasn't right, that it didn't capture what I needed to say, that it was just more excuses dressed up in prettier language. I must have filled an entire notebook with failed attempts." He sat down on my couch uninvited, but somehow not unwelcome. "I still don't have the right words. I'm not sure the right words exist for what I did to you, to this family. But I'm done hiding. I'm done letting my fear of saying the wrong thing keep me from saying anything at all." I looked at the letter in my hands, feeling its weight, knowing it contained something important, something my father had struggled to articulate for 4 months, for 17 years, for maybe his entire life. "Read it," he said. "Please. I'll sit here quietly. I won't interrupt, but I wanted to be here when you read it, in case you have questions, in case you need to say something, in case you just need someone to witness that this moment happened. I unfolded the pages and began to read. The handwriting was shaky in places, steadier in others, as if written in multiple sittings with varying levels of emotional control. But the words were clear. Dear Nicole, it began. I have started this letter so many times that I've lost count. Each time I convince myself that I know what I want to say, and each time the words come out wrong. But your mother always said that done imperfectly is better than perfect never done. So, here is my imperfect attempt at the truth. You look so much like her. The same eyes, the same expressions, the same quiet way of observing the world before speaking. Every time I looked at you, I saw Susan. And every time I saw Susan, I saw my own failures. I saw the man she believed I could be, and I saw how far I had fallen short of that man. I pushed you away not because I loved you less, but because I couldn't face what loving you properly would require me to admit about myself. Loving you meant acknowledging that I had failed your mother's trust. It meant seeing every single day the gap between who I was and who I should have been. It was easier to focus on Emily, to lose myself in being the hero she seemed to need, than to confront the shame I felt whenever you were in the room. The letter continued for 2 more pages. He wrote about the letters he had hidden, about the choices he had made in those first raw weeks after my mother's death. He wrote about the lies he told himself to justify those choices, and about how those lies had calcified over the years into a prison he didn't know how to escape. But it was the final paragraph that broke me. I am proud of you, Nicole. I have always been proud of you. Watching you become the woman you are, strong and capable and generous beyond what anyone deserves, has been the greatest privilege of my life, even if I was too broken to say it. Your mother knew who you were from the moment you were born. She trusted you most because you deserved it most. She saw a strength in you that would endure anything, including a father who couldn't see past his own shame. I'm sorry I needed 17 years to see what she saw immediately. I'm sorry I wasted so much time hiding from the truth instead of celebrating the remarkable daughter I had right in front of me. I don't ask for forgiveness. I'm not sure I would know what to do with it if you gave it. I only ask that you know finally that you were never invisible to me. I saw you. I just couldn't bear what seeing you reflected back about myself. With all the love I should have shown you, your father. I set the letter down, my hands trembling, my vision blurred with tears. I had expected more excuses, more justifications, more of the defensive explanations I had heard my whole life. Instead, I found my father for the first time. I sat with the letter in my lap for a long time, reading and rereading the words my father had struggled for months to write. Each sentence carried weight, the weight of 17 years of silence, of things that should have been said but weren't, of a relationship that had withered from neglect, while we both pretended it was fine. The letter continued beyond where I had stopped the pages, turning to reveal more of my father's raw honesty. I don't ask for forgiveness, he had written. I don't deserve it. The damage I caused can't be undone with apologies, no matter how sincere. What I ask for instead is a chance to be the father I should have been, not through words. I've said enough meaningless words to last several lifetimes. Through actions, through listening when you speak, instead of waiting for my turn to talk. Through showing up when you need me instead of finding reasons to stay away. Through seeing you finally the way your mother always saw you. I looked up at my father, who sat on my couch with his hands clasped together, watching me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Vulnerability, fear, hope. The armour he had worn my entire life was gone, stripped away by 4 months of reckoning with who he had been and who he wanted to become. There's something else, he said quietly, at the bottom of the box. I found it when I was going through everything preparing to add my letter. It must have been there for 17 years and I never knew. I reached into the keepsake box, moving aside the photographs and dried flowers until my fingers touched a small folded piece of paper tucked into the corner. It was different from the other letters, smaller, written on a piece of notepaper that looked like it had been torn from a bedside pad. I unfolded it, carefully recognizing my mother's handwriting immediately. Richard Jesus. I see Richard, it said. Love them both. Not equally. No parent can do that, and anyone who claims otherwise is lying. But fairly. See them both for who they are, not who you imagine them to be. Promise me. The note was unsigned, unfinished perhaps, or maybe my mother had felt no need to sign something intended only for my father's eyes. A final request from a dying woman to the man she was leaving behind. A simple instruction that should have been easy to follow. Love them fairly. My father was crying, now silent tears running down his weathered face. She tried to tell me, he said, his voice breaking. Even at the end, she knew what I was likely to do. She knew me better than I knew myself. And I hid from her words for 17 years because I couldn't face the truth of them. I set the note down beside his letter, 2 pieces of paper that told the story of a family's fracturing and maybe its possible repair. My mother's simple request. My father's belated confession. The 17-year gap between them filled with pain that could have been avoided if one man had been brave enough to listen to his wife. The tears came then. Not the tears I had cried so many times before, the tears of someone wounded, abandoned, overlooked. These were different. These were the tears of someone finally seen, someone acknowledged, someone whose existence had been validated after years of wondering if she mattered at all. I cried for the little girl who had lost her mother, and then in a different way, lost her father too. I cried for the teenager who had paid bills and managed crises while waiting for someone to notice. I cried for the adult who had shown up year after year, bringing gifts and hope to holidays where both were received with indifference. I cried for all the birthdays that had passed, unremarked, all the accomplishments that had gone uncelebrated, all the love I had offered that had disappeared into a void of silence. And I cried for the possibility that maybe finally things could be different. My father sat through my tears without trying to stop them, without offering platitudes or empty comfort. He just witnessed the way he said he wanted to. He saw me in my pain, in my release, in the complicated mixture of grief and relief that poured out of me. When the tears finally slowed, he spoke again, his voice tentative. May I hug you? The question itself was a revelation. He wasn't assuming, he wasn't taking, he was asking permission to enter my space to offer comfort that I might not want from him. After everything he had done, after all the years of damage, he understood that he had lost the right to simply expect my acceptance. I nodded. He crossed the small distance between us and wrapped his arms around me. The embrace was awkward at first, 2 people who had forgotten how to be close to each other, their bodies unsure of how to fit together. But then something shifted. I felt his shoulders shaking with his own tears, felt the strength of his arms holding me like he was afraid I might disappear, felt the warmth of a father's love that had always been there but had been buried under so much fear and shame. I'm so sorry, sweetheart, he whispered into my hair, his voice ragged. I'm so sorry for all of it. For every birthday I forgot, every accomplishment I ignored every time you needed me, and I wasn't there. I'm sorry for making you feel invisible. I'm sorry for hiding your mother's words. I'm sorry for being too weak to be the father you deserved. I held on to him, feeling something loosen in my chest that had been tight for as long as I could remember. The anger didn't disappear entirely. The hurt didn't magically heal. 17 years of damage couldn't be erased by one hug, one letter, one birthday visit. But something began, something fragile and new, a foundation that might, with time and care, support the relationship we had never had. I believe you. I said the words surprising me even as they left my mouth. I believe you're sorry. We held each other for a long time in my small apartment. the city lights beginning to twinkle outside my windows as evening settled over the world. When we finally separated, both of us red-eyed and drained, something had changed between us. The distance that had always existed, the invisible wall that kept us from truly connecting, had developed cracks. My father stayed for dinner. We ordered food and sat at my small table, talking in ways we had never talked before. He asked about my work and actually listened to the answers. He told me stories about my mother that I had never heard, memories he had kept locked away because they hurt too much to share. We laughed a few times tentatively, like people learning a new language together. When he left, he hugged me again at the door. "Thank you," he said, "for giving me a chance I don't deserve." "Don't waste it," I replied. He nodded solemnly. "I won't. Not again." I watched him walk down the hallway toward the elevator, an old man carrying the weight of his mistakes, but finally moving forward instead of hiding from them. And I felt something I hadn't felt in 17 years. Hope. 1 year later, I walked into a restaurant for a dinner that would have been impossible 12 months before. The restaurant was elegant, but not pretentious, the kind of place where conversations mattered more than appearances. I had chosen it carefully, wanting somewhere that felt celebratory without being showy. Tonight wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about marking how far we had all come. I arrived early, as I always did, and took a moment to appreciate the private dining room I had reserved. A round table set for 6 candles, flickering softly, flowers arranged in the centre. Simple and warm. The kind of gathering I had dreamed about for years, but never believed I would actually have. The promotion had come through 3 weeks earlier, Chief Financial Officer. The title still felt surreal when I said it aloud. I had worked for this my entire career, climbing steadily through the ranks, proving myself over and over in a field that didn't always make it easy for women to rise. And now, I had reached a peak I had once thought was impossible for someone who had spent so many years feeling invisible. Aunt Ruth arrived first, elegant, in a deep blue dress, her silver hair swept up gracefully. She embraced me tightly before stepping back to look at me with shining eyes. "Your mother would be so proud," she said, the words landing exactly where they needed to. Martha came next, carrying a small wrapped gift that she pressed into my hands with a smile. We had stayed in touch over the past year, our connection deepening from the moment she had saved my mother's keepsake box. She had become a friend, a confidant, someone who understood the weight of family secrets and the freedom that comes from finally releasing them. Then Emily walked in. My sister looked different than she had a year ago. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by a simple dress that suited her natural beauty far better than any label ever had. Her face had lost the brittle perfection she used to maintain, softening into something more genuine. And beside her, holding her hand with obvious affection, was a man I had met twice before. David, a middle school teacher who had captured Emily's heart not with money or status, but with kindness and patience. Emily crossed the room and hugged me, a real hug, the kind that meant something. "Congratulations, Nicole," she said. "I'm so happy for you." Behind her, my father entered the room. He moved more slowly than he once had the past year, having aged him in visible ways. But there was something different in how he carried himself. The defensive tension that had always characterized his posture was gone. He looked lighter somehow, as if setting down the weight of his secrets had allowed him to stand straighter. He approached me and took my hands in his eyes meeting mine without evasion. "Chief Financial Officer," he said, testing the words. "My daughter, the CFO. I wish I could say I always knew you would achieve something like this. But the truth is, I wasn't paying attention. I am now." We all took our seats around the table, and for a moment I just looked at the faces surrounding me. Aunt Ruth, who had found the courage to speak after years of silence. Martha, who had saved my mother's memories and become a guardian of our healing. Emily, who had traded entitlement for accountability and emerged as someone I was finally learning to respect. My father, who had confronted his failures and chosen to change rather than hide. And David, a newcomer to our complicated family, who had embraced Emily not despite her struggles, but because he saw who she was becoming. This was my family now, not the fantasy I had once dreamed about, where everyone loved each other perfectly and nothing ever hurt. This was something messier and more real. People who had wounded each other, who had failed each other, who had found their way back through honesty and hard work. Dinner was served and conversation flowed easily. We talked about my new role, about the challenges and opportunities ahead. We talked about Emily's job, where she had been promoted to office manager after a year of consistent, reliable work. We talked about my father's new hobby, woodworking, something he had taken up to fill the hours he used to spend avoiding his own thoughts. When the main course was cleared, Emily stood up, a glass of sparkling water in her hand. She had given up alcohol as part of her effort to live more intentionally, another small choice that added up to a larger transformation. "I want to make a toast," she said, her voice steady but soft. "To my sister, Nicole." The table fell quiet, all eyes on Emily. A year ago, I was someone I'm ashamed to remember. I took everything for granted, especially the people who loved me most. I told myself I deserved things I hadn't earned, and I convinced myself that hurting others was acceptable as long as I got what I wanted. She paused, her eyes glistening but her composure holding. Nicole showed me the truth, not by punishing me, but by refusing to let me hide from myself any longer. She held up a mirror and made me look, and what I saw was someone I never wanted to be. Emily raised her glass toward me. To my sister, who taught me that strength isn't about what you take, it's about what you give, who taught me that real love requires honesty, even when honesty hurts, who gave me a chance to change when she had every right to walk away forever. She smiled a genuine smile that reached her eyes. I spent the first half of my life trying to be nothing like you. I'll spend the rest of it trying to be exactly like you. Happy promotion, Nicole. You deserve every bit of it. The table raised their glasses and I felt tears prickling at my eyes. Not tears of pain this time. Tears of something I was still learning to name. My father spoke next, his voice rougher than Emily's, but no less sincere. "I wasted 17 years missing the best parts of my family," he said. "I let fear and shame blind me to the daughter who was right in front of me, the daughter who deserved so much more than I gave her. I won't waste another day. Whatever time I have left, I will spend it being present, being grateful, being the father I should have been all along." Looking around the table, something clicked into place inside me. A realization that had been building for months, maybe longer, finally crystallizing into clarity. I hadn't destroyed my family with the truth. I had rebuilt it. Not into the fantasy I once wanted, where the past was erased and everyone pretended nothing had ever gone wrong. Into something better, something real. A family that had faced its ugliest truths and chosen to grow instead of crumble. A family built on accountability and effort, where love was earned through actions rather than assumed through obligation. The house still stands. Dad and Emily live there now, not as people who owe me anything, but as family, who have earned the right to stay. I visit when I want to welcomed as the majority owner, and the daughter who finally claimed her place. I have my own apartment now, my own space, my own life that no one can empty while I sleep. Mum's keepsake box sits on my desk. Inside, her letters are reunited, the ones she wrote, the ones that were hidden, and now the ones we've written back to her telling her about the family we've finally become. I used to believe that being strong meant staying quiet, keeping peace, letting others take until there was nothing left. Now I know the truth. Strength isn't about suffering in silence. It's about knowing your worth and requiring others to see it too. I am Nicole Jennings. I am my mother's daughter. And from this page forward, my story is written by me. Thank you for staying with me through every moment of Nicole's incredible journey. From the shock of waking up in an empty house to the healing dinner 1 year later, This story has taken us through the deepest valleys of betrayal and the highest peaks of redemption. Nicole's story is not just about furniture or money, or even a hidden will. It is about something far more universal. It is about what happens when we finally stop accepting less than we deserve. It is about the courage it takes to stand up and say, "I matter," even when the people closest to us have spent years telling us otherwise. It is about discovering that the truth, no matter how painful, is always better than a comfortable lie. So many of us have been Nicole at some point in our lives, the one who gives and gives without receiving, the one who keeps the peace at the cost of our own happiness, the one who stays quiet because we have been taught that speaking up means causing trouble. But Nicole showed us another way. She showed us that demanding respect is not selfish. It is necessary. Now, I want to hear your voice. Have you ever been the invisible one in your family? Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted had been hiding something that changed everything? Have you ever had to make the difficult choice between walking away and fighting for accountability? Drop your story in the comments. This community is built on shared experiences, and your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If this story moved you, if it made you cry or think or remember your own struggles, please subscribe to our channel and tap that notification bell so you never miss another story. We bring you powerful, true story-style dramas every week. Stories about family, betrayal, strength, and the beautiful mess of being human. Give this video a thumbs up if you believe Nicole deserved her happy ending. Share it with a friend, a sister, a mother, anyone who needs to be reminded that their worth is not determined by how others treat them. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And always remember what Nicole learned. Your story is yours to write. See you in the next one.